call this meeting of the Natural Resources to order. It's 9:30 a.m. Let me remind all present, please silence your phones, and if there's need for conversation, you can keep it to a whisper, or maybe go out into the meeting room or the hallway. I certainly appreciate that. With that, let me call roll. Commissioner Walters.
Present.
Commissioner Anthony.
Present.
Commissioner Erdley. Present. Truly present. Commissioner Humphreys.
Present.
Commissioner Laporte. Present. And for the record, Commissioner Nyberg is excused from today's meeting. At this point, I'd like to, first of all, for those who don't know, I'm Dan Kildee. I'm the chair of the This is my third meeting, so I'm feeling like I'm starting to join the experienced members here. I appreciate all the input from folks over the last couple of months as I continue to learn this job, so thank you all for that. Particularly for some of the stakeholder groups who can so reach out on a regular basis to inform me and educate me on the issues that you're concerned with. I'd also like to introduce our newest commissioner, certainly new to this role, but not new to this field whatsoever. Becky Humphreys has a long career in conservation, starting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then right here, serving the Michigan DNR. As chief of the Wildlife Division and ultimately director of the DNR. But after that, joined the National Wild Turkey Federation. Retired from that position just recently, but continues to be involved in a number of ways in conservation. Grew up hunting and fishing in our state, and I will say I'm very pleased to welcome her, I gotta say, back to this work, but new to this role. So I'm going to ask each commissioner to quickly introduce themselves, but it makes sense to start with Commissioner Humphreys.
Well, it's good to be back and good to see so many familiar faces, so thank you for the warm welcome. I hope it continues after we have our votes.
And let's start on the line, Mr. Walters.
John Walters, I'm from Indian River, and I thoroughly enjoy hunting and fishing. My oldest German short-hair pointer will turn 13 this Saturday. Still hunting like a 5-year-old short-hair would. My wife and I enjoy fly fishing for trout regularly. We love the Caribbean in the winter. Back from the Bahamas about a month ago, and after going through an ice storm this past week, I wish I was back in the Bahamas. But we were out of power for 8 days. There are still many, I've heard up to 7,000 people still without power, so thoughts and prayers with them. I heard that they may be out of power for over a month. So if we can do anything to help them, let's please do. Thank you.
Dave Anthony, I was born in Marquette, spent my whole life in the UP, but for the most part. But work brought me in and out a little bit. But I was always based in the UP, still based in the UP, born in Marquette, out of college I moved to the Escanaba area. I moved out of town, lived in the woods and retired, had a career in public policy, never far from natural resources. In retirement, I live in the woods and do a lot of out of the back door hunting. I too am a big bird dog guy, but I lost my bird dog this past fall. I'm signed up for a new one.
Good morning, Pete Erdley from Grand Rapids. Lifelong sportsman, lifelong Michigan resident. Happy to be here on the commission and try to make a difference moving forward. And Becky, welcome to the commission.
You're here. And as I said, I'm Dan Kildee. I'm from Flint. I was born and raised there. I spent a lot of my summers in the Tawas area, hunting and fishing as a kid. And then about a decade ago, I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier meetings, after my father passed away. He's the one who took me deer hunting when I was a kid. To honor him and to get back into the woods, I started hunting again. But I've been a lifelong angler. In fact, slight admission, it wasn't a Michigan lake, but I just got back from sea trout fishing in Florida, expecting that the weather would welcome me home again. I left 85-degree temperatures to come back to snow and April. So I love our state, but once in a while, I like that springtime to show up a little bit earlier than it does. Enjoy this work, and I'm happy to be part of this. Director Bowen.
Scott Bowen, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm the current director, but I'd like to welcome Becky Humphreys, who served in this role for 7 years. I can't imagine. I've only had 17 months or so, and 7 years is a marathon. So I thank you for your willingness to serve, and also want to thank Commissioner Kozak, who was a class act. He really was, and he'll be missed on the commission. He was a good contributor.
Jim Laporte. I'm originally born and raised in Marquette, Michigan. So I'm a Uper, I guess, never get rid of that. Currently live and work in Detroit. New to the commission as of, I guess, December. I'm also a member of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. So I spent a good deal of my career running casinos in Michigan as well as other places around the country. And just happy to be on the commission. Hopefully we can make some great strides and good decisions. But I caution everybody, everybody's got an opinion. And there's no one decision, obviously, coming from this committee that is going to satisfy everybody. But I can assure you everybody takes it seriously and analyzes the information and does the best they can. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, commissioners. Next on the agenda is approval of the day's agenda. It's been distributed, so I would ask for a motion to approve the agenda for April 10 meeting.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, same. Motion carries. Next, we have the minutes of the March 13, 2025 meeting of the Natural Resources Commission. Those minutes have been distributed for review, and I would ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Is there support? Second. Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Next, as was noted, I have a new commissioner, and Commissioner Humphreys replaces Commissioner Kozak, who served as the vice chair of the commission, so we are obligated at this meeting to elect a new vice chair. I would open the floor for nominations.
Mr. Chair, I nominate Becky Humphreys for the vice chair.
If the second is in order, I think that's second.
It's just nominations at this point.
Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Let me just say that I certainly support this nomination. I appreciate Commissioner Walters nominating Commissioner Humphreys. Her experience with this field, I think, goes without saying, and I think will be a tremendous asset, not just to this commission, but as chair to me, as a person who comes to this work as a consumer of hunting and fishing in our state, to have somebody with deep knowledge that Commissioner Humphreys has to work side by side with me, the director, but also as a member of this commission, I think is entirely appropriate. An excellent choice.
Mr. Chair, so with that said, I move that we elect Becky Humphreys as vice chair.
Is there support?
Support.
Moved and supported. Any discussion? All in, if you accept the nomination, I should ask you that. I've been railroaded through a few of these. I know how to do this. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next on the agenda is the director's report, so I'll turn the meeting now over to Director Bowen to walk us through the report.
First of all, we have a life-saving award. DNR Ranger Joel Collison is the recipient, and Ron Olson is here. Ron is on the cusp of retirement. I wanted to congratulate him and maybe give him a round of applause. He has spent 22 years, Ron, is that right? 21 years as the director of Parks Division. He took it over when there was no money, all kinds of problems, and he turned it into a world-class, the number one system of parks in the country. So let's give it up for Ron Olson.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Today we're going to honor Park Ranger Joel Collison. I'd like to have you stand up, and he has some of his supporters here. We have Jody Johnson, who's the park manager at Silver Lake, and Josh Smith is the immediate supervisor. And so this is one of the things, and I should just say, 2 weeks ago I gave the graduation announcement. We have a 7-week Park Ranger Academy where we get commissioned rangers, and these folks are been commissioned rangers in the past, and we concluded that. So we have a rigorous training, and this is what I'm going to tell you. The brief story of what happened is why they have training and they're prepared and to help people in distress and ultimately, hopefully, save lives. So on June 9th of 2024 at approximately 7:30 p.m., Silver Lake Park Rangers were notified of a child buried in the sand due to collapsed tunnel within the park's pedestrian area. This is at Silver Lake State Park, which is predominantly sand dunes. After contacting outside agencies and assistant park rangers quickly responded to the location and began to aid in rescue efforts. After several tense minutes of digging by hand, the child's head was located, and at this time, Park Ranger Joel Collison pulled the unconscious child out of the sand, carried them down the dune to an ambulance located below, and simultaneously performing CPR. In a time where seconds count, Ranger Collison's actions allowed the child to revive life-saving care as quickly as possible, and Ranger Collison's quick thinking, response, and composure during this very stressful circumstances played a part in saving this child's life. So we want to thank Park Ranger Joel Collison and his counterparts, the Park Ranger staff, as a team, but he really was the person that was instrumental in that. I do have a couple of coins. We have a coin from the district, and then we have another one from the division that really talks about teamwork, and that's what it takes to really be part of a team, but well-trained. So there, Joel, let's hear it for Ranger Joel Collison. I should say that this is the last thing. I gave him one of my pens, but we always talk about being on the bus, and the idea is we're on the same team, we're going in the same direction, we're well trained, and we know where we're going. And so he's got one of our pins that say, Ron says, be on the bus, and he definitely is. So as is his supervision. So we appreciate it very much, and thank you. And we have a certificate up there that we'll get for you, and so you can put that on your wall. All right? You want to say anything?
Joel was.
Oh, yes.
Just thank you for the recognition, and I couldn't do it without the supervision at Silver Lake. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. All right.
We are going to take a brief break so we can get some photographs. Thank you so much for your service.
Thank you.
5 minutes. All right. Let's reconvene the Natural Resources Commission. Thank you all for allowing us to step up, get a photograph. Young leader who really performed the ultimate public service, saving human lives is the highest calling. And it's true that we never know. Those of you who serve in these positions never know when that moment will occur or might occur during the course of your career, but it's great to see that we've got people in this organization that step up at the most important moment in a family's life. It's something certainly worthy of recognition. Our director had to step out briefly, so this will now become the deputy director report.
Thank you. Our first presentation is Chronic Wasting Disease Monitoring and Surveillance Report. I'm going to welcome Melinda Cosgrove, I saw there she is, from our Wildlife Health section and our Wildlife Disease Lab housed over at Michigan State University. We do this every year. For folks that don't know, we give an update on where we're at with our testing efforts. And we also have our Wildlife Chief Sarah Thompson joining us and our Wildlife Health section Supervisor Mitch Marks.
Good morning, Deputy Director and Commissioners. I'm pleased to be here and provide you with an update on the Division's ongoing CWD work. As Deputy Director Hannah said, I'm with the Wildlife Health section where I serve as the laboratory manager. There we go. As the first of 3 wildlife health talks that you'll hear today, I thought I'd start with a quick introduction to our section. This is the MSU Veterinary Diagnostic Lab where the DNR Wildlife Health section staff are housed. Within this facility, we have access to a biosafety level 2 laboratory, as well as a shared biosafety level 3 laboratory. And these labs provide us with the necessary space, tools, and safety measures that are required for working with diseased wildlife. In addition, working within the facility allows us to engage in collaborative work and discussions about wildlife disease diagnostics with top veterinarians and diagnostic staff within the university. These are just a few pictures of the work we do, not only around CWD, but also bovine TB. And you'll hear about both of those diseases today, but in separate presentations. However, the work that we do for these diseases does happen concurrently, and it's only accomplished through the assistance of other state and federal agency staff that come in to assist us. I will only be covering CWD in my presentation, but our lab handles a lot of the, or most of the other big wildlife diseases that you hear about, which, as I mentioned, includes bovine tuberculosis, as well as avian influenza, EHD, and the list goes on. The Wildlife Health Center, we have a pretty relatively small group of about half a dozen staff, but the volume of wildlife health work that is accomplished each year is really a testament to the dedication of that staff. And so I always like to just take a moment and recognize the efforts that the staff does to make all of this happen. All right, so let's begin talking about CWD. As you know, it's not a problem limited to Michigan, and this is a map showing the distribution of CWD across North America. The gray shaded areas are areas where CWD has been detected in free-range inserted populations, and the yellow and red dots are locations of captive inserted facilities that have tested positive for CWD. In the U.S., 36 of the 50 states have now detected CWD in captive and or free-range deer. In Michigan, in 2021, we began a plan to conduct sampling across our entire state. And this map shows the conceptual plan that was developed for a rotational approach to that sampling. Now, our rotational approach was necessary because it's not really feasible to test across the entire state all at the same time, and so it was broken down into phases. We allowed for overlap within these phases because we knew that some areas might not be able to meet their objectives within just 1 year, while others would be able to meet them more quickly. So the phases were also designed to be adaptable. The goal of the plan is to build a baseline of surveillance data for the entire state, and the counties in gray are where CWD had been detected at the start of this plan, and that's where a lot of intensive sampling had already been occurring. However, in the remainder of the state, there really hadn't been a lot, if any, CWD sampling happening. So the rotational plan began in the southernmost part of the state, and we progressively moved northward each year. Now, as we have moved through this plan, we've been able to fine-tune some of our sampling strategies so that we could learn to focus our collection on higher value samples. And we'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides. Another important note about this strategy is that not finding CWD in these new areas is not a failure. Instead, it means that we build confidence through our sampling that the disease is either absent or that it's present at very low levels that's difficult to detect. In addition, we're also reducing concerns that there are unrealized hotspots of CWD in new areas of the state. Over the course of the plan, we've been using what's called a weighted surveillance model. This model was developed by researchers who analyzed a data set of 90,000 CWD sampled deer. The data set contained over 1,000 positive samples. The deer were then grouped into categories by collection method as well as sex and age, and then a value or a weight was assigned based on the likelihood of a deer to be positive within that group. Basically what it means is that not all deer are equally likely to be positive for CWD, so if we target our collection towards those that are, the more efficient our sampling can be. This table is taken from that research that I just mentioned, and it's sorted by the sample types that are more likely to be positive for CWD. So given this information over the course of the last 4 years, the division has worked to move away from spending resources on collecting roadkill deer and fawns, because those, while they might boost our sampling numbers and give the perception that's more being done, they really do very little to help us detect CWD in new areas. And they create just additional work that isn't helping us get at the detection levels that we're aiming to meet. I'm going to show you in the next slide. So instead, we've moved towards trying to collect these more high-value samples, and by engaging with partners such as taxidermists, we've increased our sample collection of samples like adult bucks. In 2024, 73% of our samples from surveillance counties came from these higher-weighted categories of deer, and that's in comparison to 2021 when we began this plan, where only about 56% were coming from those higher-weight categories. So there's a lot of detail that goes into this analysis, and really more than I could explain in this short presentation, but I'll try to give you a big picture overview of how we look at all of this. So the model that we're using allows us to basically estimate how much potential undetected CWD could be on the landscape based on our sampling to date. And so when we're looking at all of these, we're also looking at this based on sample populations. And these are comprised of small groupings of counties. And so our goal is for the level of potential undetected CWD in a sample population to be at or below 0.5%. In other words, we're trying to detect the disease if it's at greater than 0.5% prevalence. If we do detect CWD in one of the sample populations, then we lower that detection threshold. And so that sometimes means that more sampling is needed in order to meet that new detection threshold. And that's for the remaining part of the potentially unaffected part of the sample population. In 2024, the focus was mainly on finishing up collections in the northern lower peninsula, as well as getting a head start on our sampling in the UP. We do provide sampling targets to our staff as a guide to help them with collections, but those aren't our real goals. Our real goals are trying to meet these detection level thresholds that I just mentioned. The analysis is then run across sample populations and not individual counties. So after wrapping up the 2024 season, this is where we stand in the lower peninsula. And you can see that enough valuable data has been collected in the northern lower that we've met those detection thresholds, with the exception of the Ogama-Iosco group. And that's due to that former detection in Ogama County, which lowered that detection threshold I mentioned. So it just means we have additional sampling that's still needed there. So as I mentioned, we also began work in the UP last year, and this work actually began a year earlier than we had expected. And it really allowed us to make some progress and put us in good shape to begin 2025. The areas in lightest green here, again, are ones that have already met their detection threshold, and the ones in the shade darker are ones where there's additional work still to do. So given this information, the areas in yellow indicate where we still need to do some sampling to complete the fifth and final phase of our rotational sampling plan. Now, in addition to completing the sampling for this plan, we also continue to to sample deer from targeted removal efforts, as well as deer that are reported that are found dead or acting ill. Now, sick acting deer that have CWD-like symptoms are some of the most important samples that we get because they're most likely to be positive out of the ratio that we collect. Of the 15 counties where we've detected CWD, 6 of them were first identified through citizen reports of sick acting deer. So while this map really just highlights only our focused planned IRS for effort, please keep in mind that other sampling does continue to occur as well. In addition, testing is available to hunters in all areas of the state through direct submission to a veterinary diagnostic lab. In 2020, we partnered with both Michigan State University and the University of Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratories to come up with a way that hunters could submit samples directly to the testing labs if they were outside of one of our CWD surveillance areas. In 2020 and 2021, the service was available for a fee. However, in 2022, we started providing kits to hunters in counties where CWD had already been detected, and this allowed them to ship samples overnight directly to the testing lab and receive testing at no cost to the submitter. These kits also can help cut down on wait time for results because they bypass some of the extra handling time that's required when samples go through DNR for submission. In 2023, we also expanded these kits to the counties in the UP along the Wisconsin border, so they are available there as well. And both the fee and free options continue to be available. Furthermore, in 2023, all deer donated to what's now called the Hunters Feeding Michigan program were also tested if they were harvested from a county where TB or CWD had previously been detected. And these samples also go directly to a diagnostic laboratory. The diagnostic labs then share the results back with the DNR, and that's what you're seeing here in this table. So these are results from both direct hunter submissions as well as donated deer testing. And as you can see, not only is testing through these streams increasing, it's also a source of information of CWD detections around the state. Last year, at the time of making this slide, we were just under 1,300. The data was still being tabulated. We have surpassed 1,300 samples that went through these streams last year, and now we have more than 3,000 have been submitted overall through the stream. This table is showing work done through DNR surveillance efforts, so this is separate from the previous table I just showed you. These are ones that were collected by us for our surveillance purposes. And a lot of resources have been put into surveillance and monitoring over the years, with almost 144,000 deer tested to date. So given all that I just told you, and using the combined results of both DNR surveillance work as well as the direct submissions to the veterinary diagnostic labs, this is the current known distribution of CWD in Michigan to date. Please note that there are 46 deer that, because of changes in the way that harvest location is reported during harvest reporting, we only had either township or county level and not the full harvest location, so those couldn't be plotted on the map. However, all 46 of those did come from counties with previous detections of CWD. So in summary, we're entering phase 5, the final phase of our rotational sampling plan. And due to increased efficiencies in the way that we have collected our samples for our focused surveillance, we're ahead of where we thought we'd be in 2025. I think it's important to mention once more that our focused surveillance efforts are not the only sampling that's happening. And while I've spent a lot of time talking about what goes into the rotational plan, there is other sampling that our sampling is supplemented by a lot of other testing as well. Options are available so that anyone anywhere in the state can have a deer tested if they desire. And use of these other sampling streams, such as direct submissions by hunters or testing donated deer, works as a good complement to our surveillance. Also of importance, again, is the testing of deer from the targeted removal efforts, as well as those deer that are reported dead or found acting ill. Through the combination of these efforts, over 147,000 deer have now been tested statewide, with 317 positives identified. So looking forward, in addition to our sampling efforts, we plan to start working on backfilling a vacant veterinary epidemiologist position that we have, which will be important to helping us guide our planning efforts moving forward. And as we're wrapping up this rotational plan, we will be using this data to start working on what our next steps and new objectives will be. We also plan to begin work on revising Michigan's CWD plan. We'll continue to consider research that might help us better understand the various aspects of this complex disease. And lastly, it's still important to us to make sure that we can ensure there are options available for hunters to receive testing no matter where they're hunting in the state, even if they're outside of one of our surveillance areas. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll try to address any questions you have.
Questions? Yes, Commissioner.
Our highest prevalence, where is it and what is the number for it now?
So we don't have the current prevalence estimate. It would be in Montcalm County. That is where we see the most positives. But because we are doing this kind of baseline survey across the state to try and, as I said, build a baseline data, make sure that we're not missing different areas of it. In order to estimate prevalence, we'd have to sample in the same area year after year. And the samples that we get there have been kind of inconsistent enough that you can't get a reliable prevalence estimate from Montcalm County. So when we were sampling there consistently, it varied by township anywhere from 2 to 4% depending on where you were.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, the concern is most of the models, Mike Miller did modeling about 25 years ago now in Colorado, but it was mule deer. But I know Wisconsin just recently put out some information on a study regarding prevalence, and when you start to see that population really decline. So that's why I think it's important for us to watch that, and also important for us to manage it. If we want sustainable, healthy deer herds in the future, we got to keep that prevalence rate down.
Yeah. Yes, we do, and really, a lot of different groups are working on kind of different tools in that, and currently, management for CWD is a pretty tricky topic, right? There isn't a whole lot out there that states have found that have worked, and everybody, I think, are trying different approaches so that, everybody's doing the same thing that isn't working. We're all trying different things to try and figure out what one actually could have the best impact. Yes.
I just don't want us to lose sight. It's not just a human health concerns that people downplay it, and we haven't seen any sort of species movement of chronic wasting disease to humans. That being said, I wouldn't want to eat sweetbreads from a deer on my property because I happen to sit in that area of higher prevalence. But on the other hand, I do think for the health of the long-term health of the herd, we got to watch it, and we're going to have to manage it.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we come up to our
Commissioner Ford?
Why did the number of deer tested year by year vary so much?
So it's based on what how we calculate those on that map that was shaded in green, those undetected prevalence levels. So the model kind of tells us where those numbers stand, and then we use that to develop how many more samples we need to lower that to that kind of detection threshold that we're looking for. So as I said, in a county where we haven't detected it, it's 0.5%, right? So you can use standard sample size calculations and it's going to spit out the same number every year, which is anywhere from 300 to 600 deer, depending where you are. But we are looking at sampling over time, and so you can use those cumulative samples and lower those numbers you need each year. In addition, because they're weighted, the sample sizes that we create, as I mentioned, are hard targets because we might not need all of those if we are collecting those high-value samples. Those are set up to be generous so that if sample distribution comes from all of the groups, from fawns up to adult deer, that we should still be able to meet what our goal is of the detection. However, if we focus on those higher value samples, we get there a lot more quickly because they have higher weight and higher value.
Were you asking why the overall number we test is different each year?
That's okay. You did misunderstood the wrong question. So you meant like our total numbers that we tested each year.
Correct,
Yes,
yeah.
okay. So when you saw the really high numbers, that was right after we had detected CWD in the state, and there was a lot of interest, obviously, because it was new. We did a lot of very intensive sampling in that area. A lot of people were very interested in getting their deer tested, and we were open statewide to accepting them. The numbers that we got in some of those years were really difficult, unsustainable really for staff. And so that's where we kind of started to redesign some of our sampling to target it on wildlife surveillance, and so that this kind of human health aspect of it, or food safety aspect of it, could be handled in a different way. So that's where like the direct submission to the VDLs and that come in, is that those aren't necessarily needed for our wildlife surveillance goal of the moment, and so we can redirect some of that sample so that our staff can focus directly on the wildlife health aspect of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Walton?
Melinda, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I appreciate that greatly. I did not notice that there was any highlighted yellow around Washtenaw County. Is that as a new detection? Is that just not an update on the map?
So that detection just came in March, so it's pretty new. And right now we don't have plans. So we did a lot of sampling down there previously. We exceeded our detection goals down there. So at this time, we can probably be pretty safe in saying that it's pretty low prevalence in Washtenaw County. Now there are discussions that we're having internally about some other ideas about maybe going in. We've talked to some of the landowners, they're interested, they've been reporting deer they've seen that we've tested, and so far they've been negative. So I wouldn't say that we're not going to do anything there. Just at the moment, there's been no plans decided. So it's not part of this rotational plan, it's already been through that. It may come up in other avenues though.
And then you mentioned that there will be additional sampling in Ogama County.
Correct.
How many are you expecting to sample and for what duration?
So I can go back to the map. I don't remember what was on there, but again, whatever number was on there is the full. So right now, what happens is when we get to that detection level of 0.5%, in a county where we haven't found CWD, we're good. But when we lower it, we want it to be at 0.25% or lower in the remaining surrounding area. Right now it's at 0.35, so we've got 0.1% to go. So how many samples it'll take to get to that will depend on the quality of samples that we get in.
And what duration of time are we speaking?
Well, we would hope that we can complete it this year, but we will have to wait and see what data we get from that.
Okay. And then I remember a few years ago there was some research being done relative to genetics, and that it was thought that some genetics in deer would be would not contract CWD. Is that still ongoing, or where does that stand?
So this isn't my area of expertise, but there is still a lot of that work ongoing. People are very interested in that, and I don't know if either of you want to speak to it.
Go ahead.
So first of all CWD deer will die. So all that the genetics does is just make it so that they are less susceptible to getting the disease or succumbing to it at a longer rate. So there is no cure for CWD. It is 100% fatal. There is still some observations that maybe some genetic strains don't get the disease as much, but we're not looking into that specifically in Michigan.
But that is still being studied?
In other states, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I was just going to say, a lot of that work is happening with USDA funding presently.
And is that funding still available for that testing?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Today, yes.
He's
There's a
diligent.
lot of changes happening, as you know.
Yes, thank you.
I wonder if I can ask a specific question, and it's that Ogama and Aranac, in some references, are seen as a sort of singular geography, but then some of the data points more to Ogama. Can you help me understand that? Is that about the number of samples derived, or is there some distinction between those two? It's an area where you have to give some specific clues.
Is there a specific slide I can go back to so I can understand the question?
Well, it was a couple of different slides where Ogama and Aranac seem to.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have Ogama and Iosco.
I'm sorry,
That are
Iosco,
considered,
not Aranac.
yeah. So this comes back to how some of these sample populations are set up, and this is based on recommendations from our deer group, our local biologists based on habitat. And so there's other things that go into how we design these, but so those together help with the analysis. So those, like I said, those numbers on there are kind of targets for the county. They really just help guide our staff, but they all kind of go lumped together in the end, yes.
And the other question, you mentioned looking at some changes to the CWD plan. What's the timing on that? What do you see as some decisions? And then the other related question, and it did come up, is what we're seeing in other parts of the country. Are there particular techniques that we've seen that show promise?
I'll let you guys talk to them.
Sure. So for fiscal year 25, we're hopeful to start the planning process. I think the timeline is yet to be determined. And then the second part of that question was what's going on in.
Yeah, whether there's any, any new methods that we're seeing some promise with maybe being utilized in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I think that is ongoing. There's nothing that comes to mind. And I will say though that the state of Michigan has for years and continues to be involved both regionally and nationally in CWD meetings and research and all kinds of different places we have staff plugged in. And we're doing all of this not only internally but with other state and federal agency partners.
I think it's important to say that other states are trying different methodologies and trying different things, and we all learn from each other, but nobody's found the perfect mix of things that work.
Yeah, I guess that's what we're looking for. Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I guess I have a kind of a overlap of what you're focused on as far as methodology, et cetera, and community, because I think in the end, as a person who has been around agriculture, genetics will ultimately play a major part. My understanding that this disease, like mad cow disease, the resistance to it is brain filter. Is it the same with CWD as it is with mad cow, in that the brain filter can keep it out of certain species, and that maybe the selection of the deer species in certain areas where it's concentrated would bring that forward?
Are you talking about the blood-brain barrier when you
Yes.
say brain filter?
Yep.
Dr. Larson, will you come help us out, please?
I don't know that I'm going to help out, but I'll come.
First day on the first meeting, it would put you to work.
Yeah, this is Dr. Larson, our new wildlife veterinarian.
Thanks. So I was kind of joking, but not entirely, in terms of fully understanding the biophysiology of like the barrier that keeps it out of one species versus another. I will say that chronic wasting disease is something that we are learning new, to some degree, very frightening things all the time about. I started my veterinary career in Colorado, which ground zero for chronic wasting disease. And when I started, we were barely even understanding a prion. We had no idea that this agent could persist in the environment for an undetermined amount of time, huge amounts of time. We had no clue that it would be available to be contagious for such long periods of time in completely inanimate material. And we are learning new things about picking it up in raccoons and rodents that we're still learning. There's a lot of ongoing research there, but popping up in places that we weren't really expecting chronic wasting disease to pop up. So, in terms of going over into different species or different individuals within a species, the concern about human health, they've done experimental models with fairly artificial ways of inoculating non-human primates in order to induce a neurologic disease with CWD, and they've been able to do that through a way that people are not going to be exposed, but showing the potential that if it gets through certain barriers. In terms of taking advantage of our knowledge about those barriers and being able to genetically select or modify a species that is clearly highly susceptible to it, that's beyond my expertise for sure. My understanding of what is there in terms of the genetics, the information so far, as Sarah was saying, is that the deer with the genetic traits that are desirable, it's not that they don't necessarily get the disease, they may live longer with the disease, which sounds good until you take into account that's a longer time for them to spread the disease and not be succumbing to clinical signs, predation, etc. So there's a lot of concern about, is that the way to go, and is that going to be an effective management tool? And there is continuing research being done and being proposed to go that way. But to get back to your original question, is that the blood-brain barrier? What are the specific things that changes one, makes one animal more likely to be susceptible versus another? I certainly don't understand that, and I think as a community, there's certainly people far more knowledgeable about that, but I think we're still in a deep state of learning and determining why this particular species is picking it up. Why we're seeing it in the occasional raccoon or some other mammalian species, but not seeing it in people consuming certain products.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of gray areas yet.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Other questions or comments?
Next time.
Next. Go to
All right, tuberculosis time. So this is our bovine TB report that we do every year for the commission as well. This year we have Lisa Marcus, I don't know if he's still going to CWPL.
Yeah.
The post Emily Sewell. She's our Northern Lore biologist that works on this disease. And then Dr. Vanderklock from Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development on the ag side is going to speak today as well.
Good morning, Deputy Director Lott, Chairman Kildee, and Commissioners. My name is Mitch Marcus. I am the Wildlife Health Section Supervisor, and I am joined today by Emily Sewell, also with the NR Wildlife Division, and Dr. Mike Vanderklock with the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Here's an outline of our bovine tuberculosis surveillance and monitoring presentation today. I'll introduce the concept of One Health and illustrate how BTB is a good example of Michigan's One Health work. Emily will discuss sample collection from wild deer. I'll share some data from our wild deer surveillance efforts, and then Dr. Vanderklock will share some information related to cattle. Bovine TB is a great example of Michigan's involvement in One Health. One Health is a collaborative, multi-sectoral, and transdisciplinary approach, working at various levels, local, regional, national, and international, with the goal of achieving optimal health outcomes for people, animals, and our environment. This slide illustrates the connectedness of human health, animal health, and environmental health. And now I'll hand it off to Emily to talk about sample collection.
Good morning. I am the wildlife health specialist in the Northern Lower Peninsula, focusing on bovine tuberculosis, and I work with our staff up there to coordinate sample collection for our diseases, particularly bovine tuberculosis. So just a quick overview of our surveillance for bovine tuberculosis in 2024. Last year, we had an 11-county active surveillance area, so that would be those counties in the Northern Lower Peninsula, shaded in gray. In the remainder of the state, we have passive surveillance, meaning that hunters are able to bring deer to us if they are harvested, and the hunter is concerned they have the disease, but we're not actively asking those hunters for samples like we are in that shaded area where we do have goals established. In that gray area, we use a multiple method approach there to get those samples, staffed locations where we can collect those heads, 24-hour self-service drop boxes, permits like disease control permits and deer damage permits, and then working with cooperating processors and taxidermists, and then targeting communications like gov delivery e-blasts and local TV and radio interviews. So this graph illustrates from those 11 counties only, not from the whole state, but just from that active surveillance area, how we are getting those samples for TB. So in 2024, we can see most of them came through, I have in quotations, of check stations. Really, we don't operate traditional check stations anymore, so our staffed sample collection locations. About a quarter of those are coming from permits, and this is really disease control permits, accounting for most of those samples. And then 20% from our cooperators. taxidermists and processors, and then a few from those drop boxes. I'd like to just offer a quick point of clarification, let folks know that those taxidermists in the active surveillance area, those gray counties, are only able to remove heads from deer because of the potential disease exposure, with this being a zoonotic disease. So that's different from our CWD lymph node collection program. So just wanted to make that clarification. When we compare 2024 to the previous year, we see there was a shift from our samples that come from primarily those staff locations. And so we did see a decrease in the number of samples coming from those locations, and a slight increase from our cooperators, and even less of an increase, but still a small increase in those under self-service drop boxes. Every year we conduct an evaluation of our taxidermists and processors that cooperate with us in the head collection program, and they reported an average of collecting about 18% of the heads that they handle in their business, and that ranges from 0 to 50%. And the primary reasons they gave us for not collecting those heads would be that the hunter wanted to keep the head from mount, mostly a European mount. The deer was not from one of those gray counties, from the active surveillance area, or the hunter simply did not want the DNR to test the deer. All said that they were likely, or very likely, to participate in this program again, which I believe speaks to the relationships our staff have built with those businesses over the years that we've operated this program.
And I'll jump into data analysis with regard to wild white-tailed deer. We have over 30 years of BTB data in wild white-tailed deer. To date, we've tested over 364,000 wild deer and have found 1,044 positives. The amount of effort, time, and dedication put into the surveillance and management of this disease in the state of Michigan is impressive. I would like to express a very large thank you to our state and federal agency partners, university partners, Michiganders that care about the health of our natural resources, industry partners, and our staff, past and present, that have been a part and contributed to this very important work. This slide shows locations of 2024 wild deer detections of bovine tuberculosis. The gray counties indicate those counties in the northern lower peninsula where BTB has been detected from 1975 to 2024. The dark outline indicates DMU 452. Red deer on the map indicate locations of positive deer through our white-tailed deer surveillance efforts in 2024. There were 21 positives, 14 of which were from DMU 452, 6 were from the surrounding 5-county area, and 1 deer from Alpena could not be determined to be inside or outside of that core area due to lack of complete harvest information. This slide shows the apparent prevalence of TB in white-tailed deer from 1995, when we started surveillance, through 2024. On the left are the prevalence estimates within DMU 452, the orange outline on the map, and on the right are the prevalence estimates for the 5-county area outside of DMU 452, which is the white outline on the map. The apparent prevalence in DMU 452 in 2024 was 1.5%, and the apparent prevalence in the 5-county area outside of DMU 452 was 0.3%. Apparent prevalence in both DMU 452 and the surrounding 5-county areas seems steady. Fluctuations are expected due to variability in sampling, and prevalence increases over time in the area outside of DMU 452 could be indicative of potential spread. And then just note that these estimates are subject to some bias due to a drop in section level harvest location reporting, and the department continues to seek improvements to disease sample location information. Here we see apparent prevalence each year from 1995 to 2024, with the 95% confidence interval shown as whiskers on the plot. Since the beginning of our BTB work, we have seen a significant decrease in prevalence. Here we zoom in to prevalence over the past 5 years in DMU 452. There is no significant trend, and prevalence seems steady over time. This steady trend may be indicative of limits of prevalence reduction unless new tools are developed and implemented. Here we zoom in to the last 5 years in the 5-county area surrounding DMU 452. Once again, no significant trend, and prevalence seems steady over time. This steady trend may be indicative of limits to prevalence reduction unless new tools are developed and implemented. And now we'll hear for an update from Dr. Vanderbilt.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the ability to come and the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in cattle. I'm Mike Vanderklock. I'm a veterinarian with the Michigan Department of Agriculture, and I work with our cattle programs, which for a long time has been primarily working on bovine tuberculosis. It's about 65% of what our division does every year, so it's a big deal for us and a big deal for agriculture. This is a map of Michigan showing our current state status in cattle for bovine tuberculosis. So because because tuberculosis is the most significant infectious disease of humans in the world, has been for hundreds of years, and because bovine TB, the type that we have that's endemic in wild deer up in northeastern lower Michigan, can transmit easily between humans and animals, and can also transmit through inappropriately prepared products or unpasteurized milk. The U.S. went down the road of implementing a TB eradication program in cattle over 100 years ago. And so currently, every state in the country except Michigan has TB-free status. So in Michigan right now, we have what's called split TB status. So we have the majority of Michigan, the green area, that is TB-free status. And then we have a 4-county area up in northeastern Michigan, which contains the majority of tuberculosis that's been found here, that's modified accredited status. And it took Michigan, actually in 2000, our state was downgraded to modified accredited status, so the entire state was orange. And we have about 10,000 cattle herds in Michigan that include about 1 million cattle. And at that point in time, our TBM program needed to include all of those cattle herds. So there's been a tremendous amount of work done over about 20 years to get us to this stage with the state and federal government. It's cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and so it's really, really important to protect this status, because in areas where you don't have TB-free status, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's restrictions on movements, restrictions on products, and so this is pretty important to Michigan. The cattle industry is actually the largest economic segment of agriculture in Michigan. This is a zoom in of our TB area. So this is, in essence, that same gray area that Emily had shown on their map, which is the focus of TB, where we find TB. We have about 605 cattle farms up there. Every black dot on this map is a cattle farm. That's up in that area. So we've got the red area, that's the modified accredited zone, that 4-county area, and then Presque County on top of it. That's kind of the focus of most of the work of our TB program. We go ahead and amongst other things, we test every cattle herd in that area every year for TB. And then we have a small, what's called a buffer zone area in parts of the other 6 surrounding counties, that green area there, where we go in and test those cattle herds every 3 years, just so that we can identify if we do happen to see geographic spread, that we can find out about it as quick as possible. It's a tremendous amount of work to do this. So in 2024, we did our 16,500 TB tests in that core area, which is the MAZ in Presque County. We test the herds every year. That requires us to do over 1,400 visits to cattle herds to get that TB testing done. And along with all the other work we do on herds in there, we probably visit cattle herds about 2,500 times a year up in that area. So a tremendous amount of work. In 2024, through all that surveillance, we found one TB-infected animal in one herd in southern Alcona County. That's the first time we found a TB-infected herd in Michigan since 2022, and I'll talk a little bit more about that herd in a minute. We also, if there's TB that's identified outside of that core surveillance area, that 11 county area, what we do is we'll go and do test herds in that area. So in surveillance in deer in 2023, there was one TB-infected deer that was found in Benzie County, and there were a couple deer that were found in Otsego in Crawford County, kind of right next to our area. We went in and tested all those herds. We tested 72 cattle herds in Benzie County. Didn't find any evidence of TB in any of those. There were only 4 cattle herds in that testing area in Otsego and Crawford County that hadn't already recently been tested. We tested and we didn't find any tuberculosis in that either. It's not uncommon to find a deer every once in a while outside of that area. We've been doing that for quite a while. I mentioned we found one bovine TB-infected animal up there. This was in a medium-sized beef herd in Alcona County. This was a herd that did its annual surveillance test. One animal was positive on that test. We sent it to the lab, and the National Veterinary Services Laboratory went ahead and diagnosed that was actually infected with bovine tuberculosis in 2025. This is a herd that's in a pretty high deer pressure area. It's not in our area that has a tremendously high amount of TB in deer, but it's got a tremendously high amount of TB pressure pressure of deer on the farm. This herd actually was previously infected with TB in 2020. So this herd at that time was determined that it had spillover from the TB infected deer surrounding it. Had a tremendously high infection rate in this herd. There was about 40% of the breeding herd that had active TB infection. That is a load of TB in a herd. This herd had been negative for TB for the previous 25 years. So it gives you an indication of what TB can and will do if it has the opportunity. There was so much infection in the breeding herd that what we had to do was go ahead and depopulate the breeding herd. The owner retained the young animals to serve as a foundation for a new herd. Those animals went through 8 TB tests prior to being released from quarantine, and actually had negative annual surveillance tests in 2022 and 2023. So a tremendous amount of work to ensure that the TB was out of this herd. Also, whenever we find a TB-infected herd, we go in with a group of people. We have partners from USDA, Veterinary Services, Wildlife Services, DNR that will go in and look at a herd and to not only try to figure out, okay, where might this have gone, but where might it have come from? And what are we going to do to make sure it doesn't just happen again? And we put a plan in place in that herd. And this herd had a tremendous amount of deer pressure, so we put up a lot of fencing to, in essence, separate the cattle from the deer. So keep the deer out of cattle areas, keep the deer out of where they're storing feed, where they're feeding cattle, a tremendous amount of work. And what we're able to do also as part of that investigations is we can do genetic sequencing of the bacteria that's found. So anytime that TB is found, you can look at the genetic sequence of that, similar when you talk about genetic sequencing of humans. And that helps you then to start to compare those and figure out, okay, what's related to what and what's not related at all. And in this particular infection, what we identified was it was more than likely not a new spillover of TB, that it wasn't a reintroduction from deer again, but it looked like it was recrudescence of the previous infection. So even though all the work that was done in this particular herd, the most likely thing is that TB was still in there hiding in that herd somehow. It eventually turned back into an active infection again.
Again, how long will the bacillus, I guess is what we're talking about, survive in the soil? Could that be a factor in retaining the viability of the disease?
It could. Similar to a totally different disease, and a lot more known about TB. Similar to CWD, this is a bacteria that can survive in the environment. And there are not very many diseases that we work with that can survive in the environment, which makes it so tough to deal with. So there's a lot of research done early on in TB and found that it can survive for weeks and months and remain viable in the environment. And that's really the difficulty difficulty we have with it being in the deer is the deer aren't going up and kissing the cattle and giving them TB. Deer can come in, they can put the bacteria somewhere, they can get into feed storage areas, see the bacteria, and cattle can pick it up later and then get infected. So it's not that you need to keep the contact with deer, immediate contact, you have to keep them apart all the time. And that's what makes it so hard, because deer are very bold. They're very, very persistent in what they do, and they're very, very athletic. And so we have to deal with that, and we try to protect herds up there. In this particular case, again, it looks like the disease wasn't really related to deer, but that it was somehow still in that herd. Due to having the presence in playing up in what you just said, as we started in 2012, as it became apparent with TB in the deer, we kept seeing spillover into cattle herds, putting program in place to start to prevent that spillover, start to make that separation between cattle herds in that area. And look at feed storage, feeding sites, housing areas, and in essence, changing the culture of how you raise cattle up in that area of Michigan. That's fine. People like to have their culture changed. But it was necessary, and it's actually required up in that MAZ and Nebraska County. If you want to move cattle other than directly to slaughter, you need to participate in these programs. In the modified accredited zone, so in that red area there, we've got about 81% of the herds in that kind of what we call the core area. So just to note, this yellow area in the map, that's similar to DMU 452. That's the core area of TB up there. About 92% of all the TB that's been found has been found in that area. In that area, we have kind of what's called our herd protection program on steroids, where we work with every herd individually and come up with a specific plan of what needs it, and then we monitor that plan. Monitor what deer are doing and make changes as we have to, as deer habits change or as farmer habits change. Well, we got really good participation. We've got about 80% of herds throughout that area that participate in those programs. Pretty much the herds that don't participate are either really, really tiny herds. So maybe people that have cattle that I've got a couple steers in my backyard and I raise them up myself and I don't send them anywhere and they pretty much live in the barn anyway. Or herds that only sell cattle directly to slaughter, so it's really not something you need to do, but pretty rare to see commercial herds that aren't participating in those particular programs. So where are we today? Well, this is a chart showing all the TB that's been found. It starts in 1998 with our first cattle herd, and it goes up until the last line, I think is April of this year. And each line is how many TB-infected cattle herds we have found in the previous 12 months. Since we do surveillance every year, if you do a backward looking, it's about our best way. And so you see early on, we had found a lot of TB-infected cattle herds. We were averaging about 4 TB-infected cattle herds a year up in the modified accredited zone. We started doing our herd protection program in 2012. And we saw a reduction in that. We were averaging about 2 herds a year after that. But it was really in this core area, these really highly risky herds. That's when we came up with kind of our steroid program to put that in place. And since that time, we've really seen a reduction in those particular, in those herds. So if we say, in essence, this herd that we just found doesn't count because it really doesn't look like it was a spillover from the deer, we seem to be having pretty good success in that program. We're cautious. TB is really hard to identify. It is known to go latent, and that you can't find it and just sit and wait for the right opportunity. But we're hopeful that we're on the right board. But we also know that with experience from other countries that are dealing with this, TB doesn't like to stay stagnant. It's really hard to hold TB just at one level for a long time. You're either getting rid of it or it's eventually trying to get worse. And I think that's the situation we're in right now. We've been stagnant for a little while and we're keep trying to do more and more. And so all the things that everyone's trying to add new tools, I think are going to be really important going forward.
And so looking ahead in 2025,
We will continue to try to find efficiencies in our head sample collection. We plan to continue to conduct herd and hunter meetings. The very first one for 2025 took place on February 25th. And then I wanted to share that the revision process for our interagency MOU with USDA, MDARD, and DNR has started. And with that, we'll take questions.
Any questions?
One for the doctor.
I'll start with Mr. Commissioner report.
How do you control it geographically once it gets into a deer herd? I mean, how do you pin it down? I know you're testing and you're doing all of that, but how do you keep it confined and extending beyond if it's so infectious?
Yeah, I think it's through outreach and harvest efforts mainly. We provide control permits, and we do a lot of outreach to sportsmen in that area. And then a lot of the actions that are happening on the cattle farm front also with limits.
I'll just say that in that TV area, in 487 in particular, the feeding and mating ban was implemented there first, and then we really allowed for LLS harvest opportunities there, more so over the years than kind of caught up the rest of the state. But there was a lot of effort on the LLS harvest there in addition to the feeding and mating ban.
Commissioner Anthony?
Thank you. Hypothetically, if you were king of the deer herd of Michigan and we would implement your policy, what would you tell us to do? Be bold.
Be bold. TB is not the type of disease that normally should be able to perpetuate in a wild population. The contact rates are not enough. It's slow growing. You shouldn't see spread that should be able to be maintained in a wild population. So what you have to look at is, why is it? And why up there? And the things that allow that to happen, you need to reverse. Unfortunately, you need to reverse it to lower than what it was before it got there. So the things that the DNR and everyone's been working on for a long time, which are, you need to lower contact rates. You need to lower the number of infected animals, you need to lower contact rates, you need to prevent the spread of disease, which means you need to have lower your numbers, and you need to get it to the point where the disease is working itself out of the herd. Now in cattle, we can work it out of the herd for them. We have that kind of control. You don't have that kind of control. But I think certainly finding ways to keep that deer population down to levels that will allow that disease to work out, that's tough. We talked a lot about deer hunters. How are you going to do that? How are you going to add, I'd say, adding new value to that herd? Getting it so that you can go ahead and do that, and then being hyper vigilant on making sure that you're not doing things that allow those animals to come together. That applies on farms too. One of our big things we do on farms is farms can do things that attract deer on. We require that they don't do that. So if you have things that are going to bring deer together, that are going to have feed, that multiple deer can come in and serve as a source of transmission, we don't require you to do that. The same thing up in that area is being hyper vigilant and making sure that feeding and baiting is occurring, because that allows that disease to spread. And then looking at what new tools are there. How can we go ahead, similar to talked about CWD, what can you do to make it so deer are less able to become infected? Are they more resistant? How can you make it so they transmit less? And there's tools that have been used in the past, and I know that that's been looked at. They're slow to do, they're slow to work out stuff that hasn't been done before. But I think those things, keeping that deer population down, eliminating so they can have that contact, and then looking at new tools like vaccines or other things, I think are probably what I'd say are the right target. And those are all things that I know that the Department of Natural Resources has been focused on and putting tremendous efforts on for a long time.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, it's a pretty thorny situation, I guess, particularly on two fronts. One, I guess I haven't heard it said so explicitly that it can survive in the environment for fairly long periods of time, and it can be latent in animals. Does latent, first of all, one question, does latent mean undetectable in that animal, for one? Secondly, I'm really curious about, just from a practical and policy standpoint, what goes back to the same question on CWD. What are we learning about what works? You mentioned vaccination. I don't know if that's a realistic, practical approach, but I'm interested in what might be working. And then, what do we know? What does the data show us about some of the management techniques that are in place and how effective it's been? For example, the feeding and bathing bans. Do we have control groups that we can compare data from? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, so I guess there's been a lot of work related to the baiting issue, and I'm not familiar, but I'm guessing that some of that work has happened in this great state, and we would need to get with our deer program partners and figure out the best way to address that sort of question. Okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, kudos. It's been a long struggle. Dr. Vanderkloot, you look a bit older than when we first started working together a long time ago. A lot of my life was devoted to bovine tuberculosis. And we heard, when we brought in experts from around the world that were dealing with bovine TB, they all told us their biggest mistake was letting up on the gas, giving up on the disease or feeling like they had it conquered, as good doctor has told us, it can, it's a tough bacteria. It's a really tough bacteria. And we did early on, we did studies of the survivability of that bacteria at various temperatures in various feed sources or bait sources. We know sunlight is helpful in getting rid of it, but we've got to get rid of those situations where, we have the perfect temperatures in northern Michigan to have it persist for long periods, and it just makes it a really tough disease. So kudos to you and kudos to everybody in the room, because this has been an endurance contest to get us to this point, and your chart showing that it's at least leveled off at this point at that level of prevalence is a huge effort by everybody. We need to continue to do more so it doesn't flare up. And I had hoped early on in my career that we would get rid of this and move on. I'm not so sure if we will, as much as we'll have to keep beating it back. But a lot of hard work by everybody. The ag community, the hunting community, the clubs. So thank you.
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Can you describe the vaccine pellet that is either being implemented now or soon will be?
So I'll let Emily speak to that, and that whole vaccine study is worthy of its own presentation. I guess if you would like that at some future time, we can get the appropriate folks in the room to talk about that. But Emily handled most of that outreach in the region.
Well, and that said, maybe a 30,000-foot look at it.
Yeah, yep. So the field trial is complete, so nothing is happening right now on the landscape. And so those VDU, those vaccine delivery units that you talked about, were placed on 16 different pieces of property there. That was all private land that landowners willingly enrolled in that study, and USDA Wildlife Services and the National Wildlife Research Center folks in partnership with Michigan State University implemented that field trial and put those VDUs on those properties, and then monitored them and have since analyzed the data and published their study. So it is complete, and at this time there are no plans for any further field trials or any further research right now until we're able to have some type of biomarker that we can assure hunters whether a deer has been vaccinated or not, and that's not available at this time.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just with that, if they've been vaccinated, do they give a false positive rate on a TB test? Like in your captive situations?
So for cattle or in captive situations for the live animal testing,
Yeah.
it will go ahead and take that off. USDA has been doing a lot of work in the third year of the 5-year program down in Mexico, looking at coming up with differential vaccines and differential tests to be able to make that difference. If you're looking at it on a basis of an animal that's TB positive and you have a culture, you can tell the difference of is it a vaccine culture or is it a live bacteria culture on that side. But in live animal testing, it will go ahead and be good with the test.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just want to thank the disease team for these. I just want to thank the disease team for these annual updates. These are really, really, really good and keeping refocused at least. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure for you. Thank you. All right. Move on to the next item.
We have our third disease for the day. We're going to talk about highly pathogenic avian influenza, and this is our new veterinarian that we met a little bit earlier, Dr. Larson. And then our wildlife division chief, Sarah Thompson, is coming back from you. And it looks like Dr. Calogero is going to join us too from the Department of Ag.
Thank you. Very, very happy to be here. I have been in Michigan in this position for not quite 2 months, so very, very happy for the opportunity to be in the position to be with this fantastic agency and be in this fantastic state. Also, I want to thank Dr. Calogero for coming today. I'm going to manage the presentation, but she's here to take any questions related to agriculture. So we are going to shift gears to a virus instead of bacterial prions, talk a little bit about avian influenza. Wanted to start with a little bit of baseline on avian flu. There's a lot of terminology that gets thrown around about influenza. This is a family of very closely related viruses, and you'll hear H's and N's thrown around with this virus a lot, with no meaning of what it is. Those just refer to proteins on the outside of the virus that gives it particular characteristics in terms of its infectivity to different cells and such. And the reason it gets used so frequently is this family of viruses is really good at, when they interact with each other, combining, resorting, evolving, and so you get different combinations. And one of the more problematic combinations that we have are H5N1s, and that's the type of virus that we're dealing with right now. The other terminology that you'll hear tossed around is the high path or high pathogenicity of the virus. And the pathogenicity, that refers specifically to what effects the virus has on domestic poultry. So a low pathogenicity, low path avian influenza virus, that's going to have minimal effects on domestic birds. A high path virus is going to have large scale, high mortality rates in domestic birds specifically. So the H5N1, the specific strain, 2.3, 2.4, all of that, that's the particular H5N1 that we have been confronted with since late 2021 in this country. This virus group, avian influenza viruses, naturally occur in waterfowl, have been circulating in waterfowl probably since as long as there's been waterfowl. Generally does not cause mortalities or issues in wild birds, but does continue to resort and evolve. And there's H5s that occur in wild birds. Many times they're low pathogenicity H5s, but they can evolve to high path H5s. This is not the first time avian influenza has spilled over into domestic poultry. It's not the first time H5 has. This particular virus, though, is different in that it's been unusual in terms of persistently being maintained in wild bird populations. More commonly, a particular strain pops up and then moves on, it evolves and it peters out. This strain has persisted in wild populations, and it has caused mortalities in wild birds as well, particularly in waterfowl, but we've seen it in eagles, various other birds, scavengers, and we've also seen spillover, particularly in some of our scavenging mammals like red foxes and raccoons that are getting the disease too. Most wild birds are going to be asymptomatic with this virus, but if we do see clinical signs, they're not specific. So it can be just sudden death, can be neurologic signs, can be respiratory signs. Now, while we are seeing it in wild populations, for the most part, we're not seeing population-level effects, although there are certainly exceptions, particularly small or and susceptible species where there may be concerns about this H5N1 in those groups. How does this virus move around? Well, it's moving with the migratory pathways of the birds. So I'm sure you've all seen this previously or something similar in terms of our different flyways throughout North America. And although there is some separation down in the U.S. or in the continental U.S. as these birds go up north, there's mixing of birds, so there's the opportunity for exchange of virus between individuals as those flyway populations mix, as well as resortment and evolution of the viruses as they come into contact with each other. So it's moving northward in the spring and then moving back south in the fall and winter. And not only is that occurring within North America, but keep in mind that there's overlap of these migratory flyways, particularly up in the north, overlap with European and African flyways, as well as Australo-Asian flyways. So the potential for these viruses to move throughout the world through wild birds is just pretty incredible. Since the virus was first detected in the U.S. back in late 2021, this is work that's been done by USGS, and at this point it's been found pretty much everywhere in wild birds. Every state in the union has found HPAI at this point. Here in Michigan, we first started seeing cases in early 2022, predominantly in waterfowl, as you would expect. So geese, swans, but also ducks, mergansers, some of our more numerous species. And so really needed to develop an approach in terms of prioritizing how we were testing, and what USDA Wildlife Services had done previously is really take a watershed approach. So we're defining whether it's prevalent in particular, or not prevalent, present in particular watersheds. And so looking at representative samples and identifying what watersheds we've been detecting it in. And through the course of 2022, all of the watersheds in Michigan were positive, found all over the state. And so further refining our efforts in terms of detection, really focusing our detection efforts on higher number incidents where there were public health concerns, proximity to domestic poultry, and learning more about it in specific or particular species like eagles and some of these mammals where we hadn't seen spillover historically. 2023, we didn't have as many cases. There were over 200 detections in 2022, not as many in 2023, and it really tapered off in 2024. But towards the end of 24, started seeing additional cases, and these are the cases that we've had in 2025. You'll see of those 74 that we have reported on our website, the majority of those are in this non-negative category, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. At this point, we only have 6 that are definitively positive. The rest are in the non-negative category. The vast majority of our detections, again, have been in waterfowl, but have been finding it in raptors and other species like the sandhill cranes. And we've really had a lot of detections in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula, just a scattering above. So really pretty well documented in the watersheds on the southern part of the state, not so much in northern parts at this point. But for testing, we swab the birds, submit those to Michigan State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab for testing. They have, in my opinion, a fantastic turnaround time in terms of getting that initial testing done. When we get a negative sample from that testing, that's considered a negative. We're done. We can move on with anything else that we may need to do. A non-negative test, it's not referred to as positive, it's referred to as non-negative because it's not determined positive until it is then transferred to the National Veterinary Services Laboratory. And they perform the definitive testing on the sample. The only laboratory in the country that performs that testing is the NVSL lab. Because this is a regulatory disease with particular restrictions, that is the only lab that can perform that testing. And as you saw in the previous map, the virus is everywhere, so all wildlife agencies are submitting their samples for testing to that same lab. So everybody is getting in line for that testing, and not only all of the wildlife samples, but all of the agricultural samples as well. And I'm sure everybody's aware that this has been tremendously challenging for our agricultural partners in terms of managing this disease. The map on the left in green, those are all of the areas that have had HPI cases in poultry since the start of the outbreak. Everything is green to varying degrees of shades of green. And the numbers below that are just the numbers of birds and flocks in 2025 that have been affected. Surprise that this virus gave us last year was the spillover into dairy cattle. That was not something that was expected. And that has been profoundly impactful as well. Since the first detections in March of 2024, nearly 1,000 dairy cattle herds throughout the country have been affected by HPAI. The effects on Michigan have been substantial. Just got a couple of snapshots from MDARD's website in terms of, this is just in 2025 in terms of poultry operations, both backyard and commercial, that have been affected. And then they also have information in terms of dairy cattle first popping up in Michigan in July of 2024 and continuing to monitor and test in dairy cattle to date. So those are some fantastic resources for more information about our agriculture partners. Just a couple of things that I borrowed from poultry partners in dairy in terms of their presence in the state. Appreciate Dr. Vanderklok mentioning how profoundly important the cattle industry is to the state, but you can see some of the numbers here in terms of the economic impact of our poultry industry to the state and how important all of our agriculture, but poultry and dairy, are to the economy and to the Michigan way of life. And then this virus does have human health impacts as well, human health concerns. Unfortunately, there has been one mortality in the U.S. Related to this particular strain of H5N1. Fortunately, there has not been a lot of additional activity with the virus, so just that one mortality and then around 70 cases, most of those mild and most of those in folks that are in agriculture, either dairy or poultry. But because of the very adaptable, changeable way that this virus works, it is something that we're keeping a very close eye on in terms of the potential human health implications of this virus. So incredibly important that we work in partnership in terms of how we can address, monitor, survey this disease, communicate with the public. Very important to work with our partners at the state level as well as at the federal level our industry partners and academic partners. So just very collaborative effort in terms of understanding and managing this particularly challenging disease. And with that, Dr. Calagero and I are happy to try to answer any questions.
Questions? I guess I could just start with one. How recent has the evidence in cattle been detected? Number one. And secondly, tell me about the method of transmission for cattle.
Dr. Calagero, do you want to
So March of 2024 was when we first found the detection within dairy cattle. So it was first detected here in Michigan. We received cattle from the outside state, and the outside state was initially not showing any symptoms. It is cattle that arrived here in Michigan, and then we, lo and behold, found and determined that the original state did develop symptoms. So then that was our first case here in Michigan. We have detected additional cases throughout since March of 2024, and we're continuing to do surveillance to continue to monitor that throughout the state.
So is the assumption that the disease within cattle was as a result of cattle from other states?
Primarily what we're seeing it from the original was because of movement. And dairy cattle move a tremendous amount on a daily basis, and so biosecurity is of utmost importance in order to minimize the spread of the disease.
Which kind of gets to the issue of transmission. Can you describe how the disease is transmitted?
Sure. So the disease is going to be transmitted most commonly by direct contact between birds, predominantly oral, nasal secretions, but also fecal. It can survive for a while in the water, not nearly as long as some of the other pathogens that we've been talking about today, but does survive in waterways for a particular time. So that is predominantly how it is being transmitted between wild birds. We don't know in some of these species exactly how it's being transmitted. We make some assumptions in terms of seeing it in eagles and seeing it in predatory birds, that they are contracting that from contact and consumption, maybe either sick or dead waterfowl or some other bird that has had the virus. The transmission over into agriculture, sometimes that is, and you can speak more to this, but sometimes there's some very good circumstantial evidence that there hasn't been good biosecurity in terms of a pond with wild waterfowl nearby and tracking the virus from outside into a poultry operation. There's also evidence of it being moved sometimes between different poultry operations because it can stay on external objects and things, but where those sorts of things, not nearly as long as tuberculosis or chronic wasting disease, but long enough to get transmitted into some sort of facility.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Transit.
Thank you. From the point of view of a hunting group, upland game birds, would you consider them to be high risk, low risk, considering turkeys and rough grouse are more clannish off in the woods?
So the off in the woods is probably puts them in a category of relatively low risk. As far as I know, there have been some sporadic cases in those type of birds. My most recent physician report coming to Michigan was at Pennsylvania, and we had one turkey positive in the time that I was there, despite pretty intensive testing of both live and dead birds, because there was a extensive research project going on in terms of turkey numbers in Pennsylvania at that time. So we were testing a lot of turkeys and had one case positive. So many of those species that you described are not going to be in similar habitats for significant amounts of time to the main reservoir, which are going to be waterfowl. So their chances of exposure are not as great. So one would conclude that that's probably going to put them at low risk. We have seen that they're susceptible, but, and we don't, the why is always difficult to really determine, but because they're not in the same environment as hen and goose, they're not going after sick waterfowl in terms of its prey items like a bald eagle might. They're not putting themselves into an environment where they're going to have any sort of heavy exposure to the virus.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
How many poultry operations in Michigan have been impacted by it? How many this time?
Yeah, so in 2025, we've had 7 detections of accurate flocks. So we've got Alpena, Ingham, 3 in Monroe, 1 in Oakland, and 1 in Wayne. And then in middle of December of 2024, we had a first commercial operation detected. And then subsequently, we've had 5 additional, and I'm just focusing on 2025. So we had 6 detections that we were working on at the beginning of 2025 within our commercial poultry operations. We have been working together with USDA and with detections being found since 2022 here in Michigan Health.
Any questions? Thank you. Thank you all very much. Okay. We move into item E, small game regulations.
Adam Bump is going to join us. He's got 2 presentations and starts.
You can think of me as the intermission between disease and here. Hi, Becky.
Good to see you.
All right, so as was said, I'm going to do 2 presentations. The first is on small game regulations. I actually have multiple species, so we can stop at each one if you like for questions, or you can hand whatever your preference is. First, we're going to talk about potential expansion of the December pheasant zone in the southern Lower Peninsula. We're going to do a discussion and review of woodcock season timing, and then we have some minor technical changes primarily related to squirrels that we added at the end of this memo. There's been a December pheasant season since 1993. We did some expansions in the early 2000s, made the season longer, and then extended the zone into the thumb. The west side areas of the southern Lower Peninsula have been excluded in the past, in part due to snow depth concerns, where you can get a congregation of pheasants, which makes them more susceptible to harvest, and hunting pressure has often been thought to be pushing them into marginal habitats and lowering survival. This is the current zone, so you can see that west side, west of 131, is closed. And then the northern boundary is pretty close to the historic boundary of core pheasant range in Michigan. In recent years, we've had a request for an increase in the area that's open. This has come both from wild pheasant hunters and our pheasant release program hunters. The wild hunters have felt that there's a decline in hunters, which reduces concerns about hunting pressure impacts. And also, we haven't seen significant persistent snow depths in that zone in the month of December, so we don't think that the timing and that snow consideration is as significant a factor. The pheasant release program hunters are interested in expanding the zone to cover all 13 of our release areas. Currently, we have 3 release areas which are outside the December zone, so they have no December releases that occur. So we had some conversations both internally with our field staff and externally, and we have general support for making an expansion. Just to try to talk a little bit about where pheasant numbers or pheasant hunter numbers have gone over time. Small graphs, but the point is looking at those trends. And you can see this graph begins in 1954. We had 550,000 pheasant hunters, and now we're down almost to the bottom of the graph. I can't even guess because of the scale there, but 30,000 pheasant hunters. And we've had that low level of participation, harvest, and hunter numbers for quite a few years, and that's reduced those concerns about winter impacts to the populations. We just don't have the people out there pursuing the birds. So our recommendation is that we expand the December pheasant unit to include all of Zone 3. That captures most of pheasant range. It's an existing boundary line that most people are familiar with. It's pretty easy to implement. And it would include all 3 of the pheasant release areas that are currently outside of the December zone. So this is the boundary that we're proposing. And you can see it's just adding west of 131, and then there is a little finger that goes up on the west side of Saginaw Bay, which is zone 3 and convenient for me because we have one release area that's up along the edge of the bay. I don't know if you want to do
Questions on the?
Yeah, a quick question. On the decline in hunters and the decline in birds. So obviously we've been losing hunters in a lot of different of our outdoor activities. What's your opinion of the decline in birds? I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about avian predators, coyotes, farming practices, winters, droughts, climate change. Where are we going with pheasants? Because it used to be I'm 58. I used to hunt a lot of wild birds when I was younger, and you just don't see them anymore. And so, what's the opinion of the department on that decline?
The primary cause would be habitat loss and change in agricultural practices. So, in order to have a big resurgence of wild reproducing birds, you'd need to see landscape scale changes in those two factors. Ag practices. So we had smaller fields, more brushy hedgerows, small grains in production, fallow field production, less pressured grazing fields. Now we have more of a matrix in southern Michigan of forested areas mixed with open areas, where in the 50s you would have seen primarily open areas with some scattered forest. So those changes in practices and having a more of a connected landscape would be what you would need to see those numbers go.
So I've also heard in the past that we've done a little bit of work with, I guess, MDOT or whoever's cutting the ditches and the roadways and stuff, because that seems to be the only habitat left for these birds. So is that accurate? Are we holding off during the nesting season at least and cutting those roadsides, or are we just, they nest, we kill them, they nest, we kill them? How's it going?
There has been some changes in practices to try to delay mowing, so there may be some production there. I think some of our most highly productive areas are going to be where we have the federal conservation reserve programs that are putting in grass, and those are strips that are protected during nesting season, and so that's probably where we're having the most production of pheasants. And you can see a response when you increase acreage in those types of programs. You'll see a response from pheasants.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Anthony?
Thank you. Regarding the Upper Peninsula, because there's a population in Menominee and Dickinson and Delta, and I had a farm in Delta, and there's a significant number of pheasants. And I was grapes, and they really like fermented grape skins. But what is the secret to having them there and having them persistently remain on the landscape, since it doesn't seem to fit the same geographic and farm habits that you just described?
Yeah, pheasants can sometimes surprise you. So I would guess that some of the ag-dominated areas, and you put yourself in the banana belt of the UP where you have less snow depth. Those are probably some significant factors. Maybe some access to other winter food sources that increase winter survival. But occasionally pheasants just defy the norms. I mean, we have a resident population in downtown Detroit, and that's a difficult one to explain as well, but they've been there for decades.
There's speculation among a lot of hunters that I talk to. They say that the Sichuans that were introduced back in the 90s, I believe it was the 90s, have interbred with the ringnecks to make a more durable bird. What are your opinion on that?
I think that was the original hope of the department. I think the project that evaluated that during the time we were stocking those was not showing as much success as we had hoped for. Doesn't mean that there isn't some of that genetics there, but that was definitely what the department was trying to do back when we were doing it.
Thank you.
Other questions?
All right, we're going to move on to woodcock. Woodcock season is a topic that's come up a number of times. Commissioner Anthony, I think you had asked and had some interest in the season timing. Historically, Woodcock season has been a 45-day season, which began the Saturday closest to September 22nd. So it's a formula-based start date. That met the federal framework provisions that allowed us to have up to a 45-day season, and then that was the earliest start date that we could have. When we had that start date, we received regular requests to make the season begin with rough grouse season, which is September 15th. Prior to working for the DNR, I worked for the Rough Grouse Society in the early 2000s, and this was this, in addition to having a December season in the UP, was the #1 request I would get. Please move Woodcock season to start with the rough grouse season. Back then, the federal framework did not allow for the earlier start date. The federal framework changed to allow earlier start dates in either 2020 or 2021. And so at that time, Michigan moved the season to begin September 15th. Still had the maximum season length of 45 days, so it now ends October 29. Since we made that change, the departments received requests to return to the historic start date. And the primary cited reasons are woodcock migration timing, that the feeling is that we're missing some of the migratory birds. And also some people talk about leaf and weather conditions not being the best that early. So we made a commitment to review this change and look at some of the factors that might help us decide which start date would be better. We conducted a survey with MSU to try to get some better broad perspectives from woodcock hunters on this topic. Just to give you a perspective on woodcock populations, Michigan is in the central flyway area for woodcock. Those would be the bottom two graphs. On the bottom left, you can see woodcock populations have been estimated to be in decline gradually for years. Although you can see beginning around 1997-ish, that graph has kind of leveled out. So still a gradual decline, but the rate of decline has been reduced in the last 20 years. The bottom right-hand side is an estimate of recruitment, so how many birds are coming into the population each year, and you can see that's actually dropped a little bit, which is interesting because the rate of decline seems to be less, but recruitment also seems to be less. But this is a problem for woodcock managers for a very long time. This slow, steady decline, and it's happening in both flyways. It's primarily thought to be based on habitat loss. So when we try to look at data that could inform this decision about timing of the woodcock season, I looked for some papers that had addressed this. This is a recent publication out of the University of Maine that's been doing a ton of woodcock work. It's kind of a small, complicated graph. I've circled Michigan there, and what the gray bar is the season timing, our current season timing. That little blue box shows the estimate of when woodcock stop over in Michigan as they're migrating south. And you can see that this is projecting that we're stopping the season right about in the middle of when woodcock may be coming through. I contacted the author of this paper, and he cautioned use of this for a lot of regulatory decisions in Michigan, primarily because most of this data is eastern flyway birds. So he's using birds that decided while they were in the study to go up the central flyway instead of the eastern flyway, so that they may not be representative of central flyway birds. The other thing that it does is it combines all of Michigan into one timing of migration. And we know that woodcock are coming through the UP and the northern lower earlier than the southern lower. So it's a little off, but it is showing that idea that especially in southern lower Michigan, there may be a few days there where birds are going through the southern part of the state and we're missing them in the current season time. I tried to look at this in a different way. This is a historically waterfowl way of looking at migration. So hunters send in wings to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and they record the date of harvest. And I've graphed this for the last 3 years when we've had consistent seasons, a new season that starts September 15th. And you can see we have a peak in harvest right in the middle of October. So this would suggest that there's no other factors impacting hunters, that migration timing for the majority of the area people are hunting in Michigan is occurring in the middle of October. Those of you that grouse and woodcock hunt, though, also know that the middle of October is usually the target zone for people to go hunting or take their week-long vacation up north to hunt. So there could be some skewing there. But we're not seeing a little tail at the end where if you were having migration come through right at the end of the season, you might expect it to bounce up again, and we don't see that. Well, then I took the data when it had a formula date, and I did that so you can see the scale is 10 times as many birds because we have 16 years of data here. You can note that the September 19th through 23rd and the last two bars are including dates that weren't always open because that season shifted over time. But you see the same peak in harvest timing. So it's still right in the middle of October that we had that peak of harvest, no increased tail at the end, no shifts over time, at least the last 20 years. So this data suggests that in areas that we're actually hunting woodcock, we're probably pretty close to centering on the migration. Hunter numbers, harvest, and effort have increased slightly in the last 10 years, but they're still at historic lows. Our harvest per effort, which is a good way to look at population trends, it cleans up the data a little bit to look at how many birds per day of effort you're taking, has been stable in the midterm. So from about the 80s, if you look at that graph and drew a line through it, it'd be pretty flat. But there's a lot of volatility from year to year. And so what that suggests is 1 year you might have a lot of woodcock hunters telling you they didn't see any birds, they weren't able to get any birds. 2 years later, they had the best year ever, and that's what you're seeing with that volatility. It's likely weather patterns and slight shifts in migration timing that help make woodcock hunting a little more volatile. So we worked with MSU and conducted a survey in 2024. We used woodcock hunters from the last 5 years that have given the department emails and permission to email them. We received a little over 6,000 responses out of 93,000 individuals that we emailed. It's a little bit low of a response rate. That tends to indicate that the people that are responding are people that are pretty passionate about the topic. Something to remember when we go through some of the graphs. And we asked them a variety of questions about their perceptions of the woodcock season and population, as well as just collecting some general hunter information. And you can see the majority of woodcock hunters pick Zone 2, which is the northern lower peninsula, as their primary woodcock hunting zone, followed by the UP, which is Zone 1. And then we had about 7.5% of respondents that said their primary hunting zone was Zone 3, southern lower peninsula. Probably not too surprising. It's pretty well known that grouse and woodcock are hunted together, but we asked, what was your primary target when you were out and you were also pursuing woodcock? 68% said their primary target was grouse. It's followed very far behind by 15% of people that didn't have a primary target. That's probably someone that would, if you ask them, I grouse and woodcock hunt, they don't pick just one. And then only 13% that said my primary target was woodcock. Again, not too surprising to me. That kind of response would be about what I would expect. Hunter satisfaction over the last 5 years, we've had a majority that said it stayed the same, but then we are skewing towards their satisfaction is decreased. 34% felt that. The cause of decline in satisfaction, 74% said a change in woodcock numbers. 45% said changes in the chance to harvest the woodcock. Those first two are probably pretty well related to each other. There were 22% that said a change in the woodcock season start date decreased their satisfaction. And then we had some other categories that never broke the 10% level. People were able to respond to more than one of those categories. They didn't have to pick just one. As far as population size, This is not surprising if you ask about any species that someone hunts, I think. 53% too low, 38% said about right, and then just a few said too low. So the big question, how did woodcock hunters feel about the start date timing? This is where, as a manager, I wanted to see one big green bar and like no other green bars. I got the exact opposite. So what we see from, again, a sample of woodcock hunters that are probably the most passionate about woodcock and woodcock hunting is almost a dead three-way tie for the current start date of September 15th, the historic start date, which is a little later, and the I don't care when it is, just tell me when I can hunt woodcock group. We did have a slight preference for the current start date. So we had 38%. I think it's barely statistically significant over the historic start date. So there is a slight preference for that September 15th date. When you look at it by zone, you can see stronger preferences emerge for the September 15th opener in the UP, about even with what the statewide is for the northern lower. And then in zone 3 has a tie between I don't care and the historic start date. This isn't too surprising given that migration timing factor that we've talked about. Also when leaf on and leaf off occurs, those two are pretty strong drivers for probably what the preferences. But we also have 92% of hunters that are preferring zone 1 or zone 2 for their primary woodcock hunting. If you ask the people why they prefer the current start date, 74% are saying it's the better alignment with rough grouse season. So that's the reason why they want it. They want to be able to go out and start hunting both species at the same time. When you ask the historic start date, they're willing to select a lot more categories, but by far, most of them are saying they can get better aligned with woodcock migration timing, followed by leaf on and leaf off, which is what we were hearing from the individuals that were contacting us. So when we get down to trying to figure out what we should do, we come up with no strong preference from the department or stakeholders. From the departmental perspective, there isn't really a strong biological push to have the season on either start date. Historically, trying to center on migration timing has been something people have tried to do if you want to try to protect woodcock that are breeding here. It's not clear whether that's what's best for the central flyway population or not, but there isn't a biological need to do that. The stakeholders are fairly evenly split, but the data does show a slight slant towards retaining the September 15th opener. We have more hunters that are preferring that. We think that migration stopover timing is covered in the primary hunting range. We have low participation in zone 3. It would provide some consistency in regulations rather than having a reg for 3 years and then switching it back. And I guess my caution is this data screams to me, after more than 2 decades of working on harvest regulations for a lot of species, that this shows a high probability of a flip-flopping regulation. So the chance of, if we change it back to the historic regulation, I'm back here in a few years because we're hearing from the people that would like it to be the 15th, and then when we change it, that you see me again talking about changing it back to the historic start date is pretty high. So trying to select one or the other, we can see that we're probably going to appeal to about the same number of woodcock hunters either way. And I think I can, let me just whip through this one, it's really quick. So the technical administrative changes I have are that we're proposing to move red squirrel and ground squirrel harvest language from Chapter 9 in the conservation order, which is a nuisance chapter, to Chapter 3, which is harvest regulations, just to make it more consistent. And then we have some duplicate language regarding hunting restrictions on parks and rec land. That's both in Chapter 9 and in Chapter 7, and we're just trying to remove it from Chapter 9 and retain it in Chapter 7. So no changes to regulations, just cleaning up where they are in the order.
Okay. Any questions on either this last item or the Woodcock issue? Yeah.
This is anecdotal, mind you, but when I was a young bird hunter, and I didn't care if it was grouse or woodcock, oftentimes we would flush both grouse and woodcock on the same day. Over the past 5 or 6 years, I've really noticed going out in the woods in the areas that I typically hunt, and it's all going to be woodcock or it's all going to be grouse. Is there any evidence of that being separate? Or is it just me and anecdotal yes?
I'm sure that you are having that experience. I don't think there would be a biological explanation. It would probably be hunter behavioral change, maybe.
You should talk to his dog.
He's a better hunter than I am.
Yeah, I can't think of a reason why. They're not going to exclude each other, so their behaviors between each other isn't going to cause one species to move or not be present because the other is there.
Coincidence.
So it may be coincidence. Maybe your dog focuses on woodcocks when they're there. And
Grouse would pop anyway, but okay. Relative to flight migrations, and obviously last year was a strange one due to warm temperatures, and you took the survey, or the survey was taken in 2024. Did that have any influence on how those questions got answered, or did you analyze that?
It's possible. The questions were worded to try to ask them more about their experience over the past 5 years, to try to avoid that. But yet, there was a lot of discussions about people having a poor year this fall. So I don't know whether that played on the minds of some of the respondents or not. I'm not sure which way it would skew the data if it did. But we did try to ask about trends in their experience over the past 5 years.
Well, and I think I agree with you from the standpoint of being that hunter preference is really close between November 15th and historic data. You will be here every 2 years changing our mind. And I really prefer consistency, so I like the September 15th date. Yeah, it's a little warm and there's plenty of foliage on the leaves, but that too will work itself out.
First of all, good presentation, and I appreciate all the work you went through to try and figure out what people really wanted out there in a, in a reasonable manner. I will take exception with one thing. I am old enough that the historical date was September 15th. And I moved it off of September 15th and all the complaints that we got with that.
So I dare ask you what year that was?
I don't remember. Do you know what year that was?
It had to have been before late 90s.
Yeah, probably. Probably. But I also know it was frustrating going out there. I mean, first you can't hit anything because the leaves are so thick on the trees, and then your dog, finally does point a woodcock for you, and you can't shoot it. So it was an exercise in frustration. So anyhow, nice presentation.
Any questions or comments?
Have you considered a staggered season? Did that ever come up?
Staggered seasons, yeah, I am extremely wary of those. I think they tend to create this whole scenario that we just described, but just doubling it. So the federal regs guidelines do allow us to do a split, but currently there are no zones that we could do, so that we could have the whole state have a little break and then have a little bit later season. If we try to work with the federal framework to have it change to allow Michigan to do zones, then what you encounter is where do you draw the zones, what are the season dates for the 2 zones, and watching, I've never had to do waterfowl in my career, but watching my counterparts deal with it, it's a big challenge. And I think the net gain that we would have would not exceed the amount of frustration that would create, not just for the department, but for stakeholders as well. One last thing I wanted to mention about the season timing is that the memo that you have does not have a change recommended, but we did leave the order open, and we're open to an amendment that would change the historic opening date at the commission's discretion. The federal timing doesn't allow us to delay the decision if we wanted to implement a change in 2025. They're holding the Federal Register open for us until a decision is reached in May, but we can't put it off because we have to fit with that federal framework. So I just wanted to point that one thing out. And Sarah's reminding me I should be at my next slide. Get my dog in, my old dog. And there is a woodcock in that picture, if you can find it. I can get him on camera. I'm pretty sure that bird would.
Can I put my dog's picture on?
If it has short hair and a short tail, yes. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about fall turkey regulations. Turkeys are on a 3-year cycle. And the fall turkey season has been relatively unchanged for years. We thought this cycle would be a good idea to review the objective of the fall season, the performance of the season, and look for possible ways to simplify and streamline regulations. So our season objective, I think, since we've had the beginning of a fall season, has been to maintain turkeys within biological and social carrying capacities. So that's primarily reducing populations where they're too high or controlling nuisance problems that we may have. But what we've seen is that our harvest in the fall is very low and that we can't achieve either of those objectives unless it's maybe very localized nuisance control. And then this objective of maintaining biological and social carrying capacities restricts a lot of consideration that we may have for structure changes in areas of the state that are open to fall hunting. So we decided we'd change this objective to make it a little more flexible. This is in recognition of those harvest realities that we just aren't achieving those goals. We don't have a high enough harvest to do that. And to get more flexibility in management decisions for fall hunting. So our new objective is just to provide recreational opportunities with the caveats that we don't want any undesired population impacts and that spring season would take priority. So if we do see population declines and we need to cut back, it would be with the fall season first. If we think the fall season is having any impacts on spring, then we try to cut that back. And then we recognize that the fall season could still have some local scale nuisance control values. So once we changed that objective, we had some conversations with stakeholders and with staff about what we want the fall season to look like now. We currently have 11 turkey management units, a mix of private land only and general licenses, multiple different quota hunts, which all have a drawing, although most of the licenses are purchased as leftover licenses. We have portions of southeast Michigan and most of the northern lower peninsula that are closed to fall turkey hunting. We do allow multiple turkeys to be taken in the fall. If there's quotas that are unmet, you can buy 1 turkey license per day in the fall until they're gone. So what do we see with hunter participation? We're finding most hunters only buy 1 license. Most only harvest 1 turkey. The majority of licenses are bought over the counter as leftovers. And in recent years, we just haven't expanded the area open. We haven't had any population or nuisance issues documented, but we have had desire from staff and public for increased opportunity. I'll just show you a couple graphs with some of this data. You can see 96% of fall turkey license buyers are buying 1 license. 3% bought 2, and then beyond that is virtually none. We had almost all hunters taking just one turkey. There's 231 hunters in the 2023 season that are estimated to have taken 2 turkeys. So again, we're not having a lot of multi-bird harvests going on with our current regulations. This graph is mostly the bars to take a look at here. You can see those white bars are showing the licenses that are bought through a drawing, and the black bars are the licenses bought as leftover licenses. The vast majority of licenses are not going through a drawing, which brings into question the need for drawings when you're not needing to throttle back that purchase. Our statewide total harvest in 2023, which is the most current survey report that we have completed, was estimating about 3,600 turkeys were taken. That's about a 26% success rate. 91% of those turkeys were taken on private land, and 60% of those turkeys were male. The question on the survey was whether the turkey has a beard or not. I'm just using that as an equal equivalent. Hen harvest is about 1,500 statewide, so that's the total number of hens being removed from the population. That's a minimal hen harvest that we don't expect any population level impacts for that kind of harvest. It's a good visual of the regulations. You can see there's 11 different units. In the southern lower, we have unit YY that overlaps a bunch of those units. The gray area in southeast Michigan is one that's only open to private land during YY. You can see that chunk in the southeast and the northern lower that's currently closed. So our recommendation is to reduce the fall turkey management units down from 11 to 2. We'll retain Unit M, which is the entire Upper Peninsula that already exists. Create Unit I, which is the entire Lower Peninsula except Monroe County. In Monroe County, local staff feel like the populations are still increasing, and they're concerned that being so close to that population center, opening it could have undesired impacts. So we're recommending leaving that closed. We're proposing moving all licenses to over-the-counter with no drawing, so eliminate the drawing system for fall turkey. All of the licenses available would be general licenses available for all lands. That's going to improve some flexibility, make it less confusing about which license type to pick. We're proposing a quota that would be on a first-come, first-served basis for Unit M at 2,200. That's an increase of 700 licenses from the current quota. We met with the UP Turkey Stakeholder Work Group, and they were supportive and helped us select that number as a trial for this new system. So we would publish the date the licenses would become available, date and time, and people could buy them until they were gone. Unit I would have no quota, so you could just buy a license whenever you wanted through the close of the season. But we are proposing a 1 license per person season. Just one little check. When you're expanding and increasing this flexibility, you don't want to open the gates completely. You want to have a little bit of protection there. And since so few people are taking multiple birds, we don't think that that's a significant impact on recreational opportunity. Now, this is what the new regulations would look like. Just to put it in comparison, when we're looking at reducing complexity and making regulations more streamlined, as a manager, I don't want to give up any of the regulations that we need to achieve a specific purpose, but when we don't need them to accomplish any of our goals, it makes sense to me to try to eliminate them, and that's what we're looking at doing here. The fall season proposal will expand opportunity and reduce regulation complexity, much more area open, a lot of flexibility in where you can go. You don't have to be restricted to your unit, the old units. We don't expect any population level impacts. The reduction of licenses per person will reduce opportunities for few people, but not many, so we think that's a minimal impact. This was supported by our field staff, by the National Wild Turkey Federation Michigan chapter, and the UP Turkey Work Group. And like my other memo, this memo has a small minor admin changes. In the mentored youth section, we're removing the word youth because it's just the mentored hunting program. And then there was a few places where we had some duplicate words in that section that we're just taking those out for cleanup.
Yes, Commissioner Walters.
Was it discussed or has it been contemplated to go with, in the fall turkey season, bearded only?
We talked about it a little bit, and I talked, we hosted the Deer and Turkey Symposium this year, and I talked about that with some of the other states. Ohio has had some requests to move to that. Because our harvest is so low and we don't expect any impact, we don't think that it's necessary to make that kind of change. But we did look at it as if we move to a place where we think we need to start cutting back on fall opportunity, it could be an option to move to males only before just closing the season. So it's an option that we have there, but we don't think it's something that's necessary right now, so we don't want to reduce opportunity by not letting hens be harvested.
Are turkeys susceptible to the influenza we just heard about?
I think you got a better answer from Dr. Larson than I could give. But because of the nature of turkeys and where they are, we haven't seen places in the country yet where we've seen a lot of die-offs from HPAI. They're susceptible to the disease like most birds are, but we just haven't seen it occur in wild populations yet.
Thank you.
Yes.
To segue onto that, I'll transmit a question that was asked to me. Is that, and I'm sure way out of your bailiwick, but it does deal with migratory, with upland game birds. Is there a concern about eating birds given avian flu?
Dr. Larson?
He's not in the room, but as long as everyone's following the general consumption guidelines and handling of game animals, one should be safe.
Cook them, in other words.
John, I just wanted to add on to just to repeat what Dr. Larson had said so that you can, hear it again. Turkeys just start hanging out with the kind of birds, waterfowl, that are, more susceptible for spreading the disease, so that's probably why we're not seeing a lot.
Yeah, if I may,
Yes.
in a prior life, I was concerned when we first started to see high-path avian influenza, because commercial turkey operations are hard hit. I mean, turkeys die like crazy in those. And so we really worked with the states to try and figure out if they were seeing loss. And we just haven't been able to find it. So that's good, and I think it probably, given the fact that their domestic cousin readily dies from it, they're probably just physically not coming in contact with birds that are carried.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you back here in 3 years, Adam.
For the other side of the story.
All right, thank you, Adam. Now on to deer regulations. Chad Vita was here. He is our acting deer outdoor specialist. And the other Chad's coming down. Chad Stewart, I'm sure you all know. Take it away.
All right, well, good morning, almost afternoon. How's everybody doing? Ready for one more presentation?
All right, fire away.
All right, as you mentioned, Chad Vito, the last year or so I've been filling in as the deer elk and moose specialist, and we are going to be talking about before I get into that a little bit, I want to take a step back and just recall the deer management initiative process we went through in 2024 that did conclude, and part of that process, the Commission had recommended that we develop some deer advisory teams to try to continue to get stakeholder input on deer regulations. So we do have two deer advisory teams, one for the Upper Peninsula and one for the Lower Peninsula now. The goal of these deer advisory teams is to try to build a long-term process for reviewing deer regulations, provide an opportunity for continued stakeholder engagement, and work with those groups to help develop recommendations for the next regulation cycle, which is from 2026 to 2028.
And it is a goal, it was brought up in the deer management initiative process, and a goal for us to try to stick to some of these 3-year regulatory cycles. So we're not back here, every year changing regulations. That can be confusing for our hunters and does not provide an opportunity to see if a particular regulation change actually has an impact. It's hard to do that after 1 year. So if you remember last year, Wildlife Conservation Order Amendment number 6 of 2024 was passed in July of last year, and that regulation was to only allow antlerless harvest during the Liberty and Independence hunts starting this fall in 2025. And the department has been asked to review that regulation, and we have, and we are recommending changing that and removing the antlerless only provision and bringing it back to the previous regulation allowing antler or antlerless harvest for participants in those 2 hunts. We've maintained that mentors are best suited for assisting in those harvest decisions for participants in those hunts. To provide a little context for those who haven't seen some of these numbers, this is just for the Liberty hunt. The last 3 years, you can see the total harvest, around 5,000 to 6,000 deer per year. Well, 80%, almost 80% each year has been antler deer versus antlerless deer. When you look at the total harvest, when you compare those numbers to the total harvest, we're talking about 2% of the total harvest each year is occurring in the Liberty and Independence hunts. And I didn't include Independence hunt numbers on here. The last 3 years, we're harvesting about 400 deer total in the Independence hunt. So just didn't see the need to include those numbers. So to provide a little bit of data on the youth participation from our 2023 male harvest survey report. This graph shows the participation rates for eligible youth. So you'll see, in the last several years, we're kind of holding steady around that 40 to 45% participation. So that's 40 to 45% of eligible youth are participating in that Liberty hunt season. So you'll notice a very large dip in 2013. That was when we removed the age requirement. So it used to be you had to be between the ages of 10 and 16 to participate in that hunt. And in 2013, we removed that age minimum. So that kind of opened up the pool to a lot more people. As you've seen in the last several years, we've kind of rebounded. So I guess the short answer here is only less than half of the eligible youth are participating in the Liberty hunt. So here's some data from our 2023 male survey. So this was before the regulatory change that went into effect last year. What I want to talk about a little bit is the statewide numbers for some questions that were asked on that survey particularly. So this first one was the proportion of deer hunters who agreed or disagreed with regulations for the youth hunting season at that time. As you can see on the bottom here, it was relatively split. We had 36% agreed, 26% disagreed, and 29% didn't agree or disagree. When you break those numbers down by age groups, it starts to show a little bit more of the story. So in this left column highlighted in blue, you can see the ages of the participants who are eligible that were asked that from ages 0 to 9 or 10 to 19, they had high agreement that they agreed with those regulations at that time. So this was prior to the change last year. And as you go up in the age brackets for that question, you see the agreement rates kind of go down. So that survey also asked the question specifically if the participants in the survey agreed or disagreed that youth should be restricted to taking only antlerless deer during the youth season. And here again, we got some pretty fair split. 40% did agree with that statement, that youth should be restricted to antlerless harvest. 30% disagreed. Again, 22% did not agree or disagree. Again, you break that down by age group. The bracket here on the far right on the bottom
that's highlighted. You look at those age brackets of the cohort who is eligible for the season, they highly disagree with the statement that they should be restricted to antlerless only harvest. And as you go up in the age brackets, that's where you see more agreement with that statement. So as this past winter, we started working with these deer advisory teams a little more closely now, and one of the first things we talked about was this regulation. And both teams spent some time discussing it, and both have provided statements of support with changing it back to antlerless or antlered opportunities. So here's the Upper Peninsula Deer Advisory Team statement, highlighting the recommendation to reinstate antler harvest opportunities to participants in that hunt. Here is the Lower Peninsula Deer Advisory Team's statement, similarly recommending restoring antlered opportunity. And they also wanted to commit to working with the department on further opportunities to educate Michigan hunters on the benefits of antlerless harvest. Moving into the regulation for antlerless harvest options during the archery season in the Upper Peninsula. The department was also asked to review these regulations, and we have done so. But just to kind of take a look at what the current regulations are, you can see in the Upper Peninsula there are several combinations of options for harvest, depending on your license type and depending on the time of year and what season you're hunting in and the location you're hunting in. So kind of break that down a little bit. In our high snowfall deer management units in the northern Upper Peninsula, the current regulations have antlerless harvest being prohibited on the single deer or the combination deer license during any archery season. And you can see that on the table kind of highlighted. And no universal antlerless licenses are available in this part of the UP as well. Our mid-snowfall zone in the middle part of the UP, antlerless harvest is prohibited on the single deer or combination deer license during the late archery season after December 10th. So here on the table you can see the right or the left-hand side is kind of highlighted. Hunters are eligible to harvest an antlerless deer on a single deer tag or a combo tag during the early archery season, as well as the late archery season through December 10th. But after December 10th, they're not allowed to harvest an antlerless deer. There are some antlerless licenses available in this part of the Upper Peninsula. The west part of this mid-snowfall zone is DMU 352, and there are currently 500 tags available via application for antlerless tags. The east half, DMU 351, there are no tags available for antlerless tags. You move into the low snowfall zone in southern UP, antlerless harvest is allowed on a single deer or combo license during any of the archery seasons, and there are also universal antlerless licenses available over the counter for this part of the Upper Peninsula. So the appropriate sections of the Wildlife Conservation Order will be open to help facilitate some of these discussions. We did, as a department, make this recommendation in 2020 and 2023. It was also a part of a package of recommendations from the UP Deer Management Initiative Group last year, but the commission didn't approve any of those recommended changes either of those times. But the reason it's being brought up this year is because the Upper Peninsula Deer Advisory Team did vote to make this recommendation and bring it forward to reinstate the archery doe tag option on the combination license and the single deer license UP-wide starting this deer season. We do have additional supplemental information in your packets if you would like to look through that as you're considering that regulatory recommendation. So the rest of the changes I'm going to discuss are largely administrative changes. The first has to do with the early and late antlerless firearm seasons in the Lower Peninsula. So last year at the July meeting, the regulation was changed to allow hunters during the early and late antlerless firearm seasons to be able to hunt on public or private land. And the Charlevoix and Leelanau DNUs were inadvertently left off of that list. I forget if it was for the public or private land portion. So this administrative change is to clean that up and make sure the intention of that regulatory change was to open up all the mainland Lower Peninsula deer management units to be open for public and private land antlerless harvest during those seasons. Next administrative change has to do with our urban archery season. If you recall, the season runs from January 2nd through the 31st. It was created in 2017 for Wayne, Macomb, and Oakland counties to provide a little extra opportunity in some of those areas where deer hunting is a little more of a challenge in urban and suburban areas. And last year, that was expanded to include several other counties in the southeast Lower Peninsula as well as Kent County to allow more opportunity. And our proposed change is just to change the name from urban archery season to the January archery season. That just kind of makes it a little less confusing, better aligns with the current regulation, and just reduces that confusion for hunters. Next administrative change has to do with our deer damage shooting permits. So these are permits that the department issues to farmers who are experiencing agricultural or horticultural damage. These are issued outside of regular hunting seasons. So graphs here kind of help paint a little picture as why we're making some of these administrative changes. So the upper left here is the southwest Lower Peninsula region, and the bottom right is for the southeast Lower Peninsula region. But what these graphs show, the numbers aren't particularly important, but the trends are what I want to highlight. That shows the number of permits we've issued in the past 10 years, the number of tags, and the number of deer removed on these permits. So when you combine the two and consider the whole southern Lower Peninsula, we've seen 176% increase in the number of permits the department's been issuing to farmers in the last 5 years, from 508 total permits in 2018 to 1,400 in 2024. Broaden that out to 10 years, that's a 236% increase from only about 400 permits issued in 2015 to 1,400 last year. So the first change we are recommending is to remove the authorized shooter list. So currently, permittees are required to maintain a list of no more than 15 authorized shooters on their permits. And any changes to that list require our staff approval. So if they want to add a shooter, remove a shooter, they have to get staff approval. So we are proposing to just remove that list entirely and allow anyone with a printed tag that is eligible under that permit to be a legal shooter. That provides some flexibility for the permittees to make those changes to the people who there had to administer those tags on their properties. And it does alleviate the workload of our staff as well. We've had several cases where a permittee may be trying to make a change and they're waiting for staff approval, maybe over a weekend, or maybe a holiday, or somebody's on vacation, and they've got to wait for our staff to approve that. So this would alleviate some of that. The next administrative change has to do with the permittee designation. So what we're proposing is to allow an authorized designee to apply and administer a permit with written permission. So currently, the way the regulation is written, the permit has to be issued to the landowner. So what we're proposing is to allow an authorized designee to request a permit and administer that permit on the landowner's behalf. So a lot of times we'll have, might be a mom or a dad owns the property, they don't have any interest in getting the permit and administering it, so they want one of the kids to do it, or maybe a neighbor, or you might have neighboring landowners who want to work together and have the same shooters, work together. This would allow them to combine and operate under one permit instead of 2 or 3 or 4 in some cases.
And it could also allow a leasing farmer to apply and administer a permit on behalf of multiple properties they might farm with written permission from those landowners. So this would provide a lot more flexibility for these farmers to administer these permits, and it would reduce the workload of our staff as well. As you see, the number of permits have increased in the last 5 to 10 years, allowing the combination of some of these permits could alleviate some of that workload. So that is it, and take any questions.
First, would you bring it back to your first slide?
Scroll back through. Fortunately, I didn't have as many as I had on.
Okay, it says per direction of the NRC, the department has established 2 advisory teams. The Upper Peninsula Deer Advisory Team. Now, that's rewriting history. When we put this together, Chairman Baird created deer management initiatives, which had the participation of the commission. That was an agreed to participation in that we would participate in the meetings, at the Zoom meetings and the in-person meetings. It evolved this year where there was an assumption by commissioners who participated that that would continue. I was sitting in the UP meeting, Zoom meeting, and I was told by the person in charge of that this is no longer the DMI, that from now on they're working just with the DNR, and the commissioners are no longer, I believe the word was, welcome to participate. At which point I stopped participating. I had a conversation with Chairman Baird about that. He was no longer chairman. But it was a very good conversation. There was another participant, and that was Commissioner Kozak. So what we have now is a recommendation from a group that represents, on paper, the Natural Resources Commission, which has not been invited to participate in this process. And this has been an ongoing sore spot with previous commissioners. I'm the legacy of that. And participants, particularly from the UP, who do not believe that they have had proper participation. I just want to bring that up right now. You're going to hear this afternoon from a lot of people. And that exclusion, that sense of exclusion, I share. Thank you.
I'd like to address that, please. So the department was asked to create deer advisory teams, so we did so. When we had virtual meetings, commissioners were invited to those meetings. I don't remember saying you were excluded. I'm sorry if you felt that way or if somehow we made you misunderstand that. However, you had the virtual invites to all of those meetings, and we certainly wanted you to participate. And if you want to participate, we certainly welcome that.
I strongly disagree, and I suggest that you reach out to previous commissioners and confirm that assumption. Secondly, that the commissioners were invited to participate last year. Yeah, they were invited to participate. The NRC created the process, and the process was designed by your staff. But there was a great sense that it was designed to keep us from participating, and that continued this year with an almost exclusive, not including us in the process. I take umbrage to that, and I want that to be known publicly.
Any questions or comments? Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk to the increase or not an increase for the age class after the youth hunt? So the 10 to 16-year-olds, what is recruitment at 19 to 22 or whatever, or 17 to 22, whatever you guys class it? Did it work? Because that's my understanding is why the youth hunt was put in place, was to increase recruitment of young hunters. So did it work?
So I do believe we have a, it would have been in that 2023 survey as well. Age brackets were followed as they participated through several age brackets. And participants who did hunt in that early season were more likely to buy a license later on as they aged out of that. Hard to nail down whether that was a result of their inclusion in that season or if they might have just been more avid hunters to begin with. So I think that's the best data we have. I don't know, Chad, if you get some additional comments on that.
The only thing I think I can add is I'm certain that when the youth season was originally created, that there was this.
What year was that, Chad?
I believe it was 2001, 2000. 2000? Okay, yeah. That there was hope that providing that early opportunity for youth hunters to go out and be successful would lend itself to increasing recruitment rates. I can sit here now and look back with the advantage of 20 plus years of history and looking at that, and maybe think that having 2 days of opportunity in September is probably not the make or break between making a hunter or not making a hunter out of someone. So really what we viewed it as currently is added opportunity. We know our youths today have a lot of things fighting for their time that maybe they didn't have 20, 25 years ago. So having that dedicated weekend for them where mentors can go out with them and make it all about them still has a lot of value to it, to make that weekend about them. And then certainly leaving the decision for either participation or harvest up to the mentor is there for their opportunity. So they can choose to participate if they feel like it's better from a recruitment or investment standpoint in their time to be a part of a traditional deer camp later in the year. They certainly have that opportunity as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
One of the graphs showed the percentage of youth in certain categories that participated of eligible youth. I guess I was a little confused about that data. How did you define eligible youth? Because the numbers seem high based on a total population cohort.
Yeah, so I believe the eligible participants would be any youth prior to 2013 would have been age 10 to 16 that had bought a license. After 2013, it's any youth 16 and under would be eligible to hunt in this early season. But we're only seeing 40 to 45% of those youth participating in that season. So that's to say the other half of those hunters are waiting until the other seasons to participate.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Right here.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Commissioner Walters.
I think we all recognize that the total number of deer harvested during the Liberty hunt or youth hunt is low. And the main reason that this regulation was implemented and passed was to educate the youth that it's okay to shoot does. And your screen showed 80% harvest were antlered deer. What measures are being looked at or considered or implemented by the department to educate the mentors who are describing what the kid can shoot or can't shoot?
Yeah, and that's an ongoing, challenge for us as a department too. But as you saw in the statement from the Lower Peninsula Deer Advisory Team, they spent a lot of time discussing that and potentially, trying to develop some ways to do that to try to help educate hunters and, especially mentors to increase awareness of the positive benefits of antlerless harvest, particularly in the Lower Peninsula.
Can you give me any examples as to how we're going to do that?
Don't have that as of yet. Well, we've been trying to emphasize antlerless harvest for quite some time from a communication standpoint. We've had our technology staff develop graphics and talk about the impacts of antlerless harvest and the need to take really probably about a third to 35, maybe even 40% of our deer herd annually to maintain the current population. And if we want to get into a reduction mode in certain areas, that number has to be higher. So we've really talked about that and hit that quite a bit on social media. We've got public letters that have been written and expressed in past years talking about the importance for harvest. It's difficult, Commissioner Walters, as you can understand, because even our current adult licensed hunters tend to prefer taking antler deer as well. So these are the same individuals who are mentoring our youth, and that number is clearly much higher at the 80% mark, as Chad mentioned. But our goal is to try to shift that tide to really focus more on antlerless harvest long term. One of the advantages now of having these advisory teams is to help with some of those communication points and what they think might resonate with the public broader. So we can certainly talk about approaches for education with those advisory teams and see what we can implement moving forward. So we have been working at it. We continue to want to work at it, but we still maintain that it's going to be a cultural change, and that really is best done through educational outreach and efforts.
And I clearly recognize this is not the sole obligation of our youth. I've been accused of that, and that is far from the truth. This is a complete hunter responsibility, and it all comes down to pulling the trigger, right? So, yes, we passed the regulation to start the education effort very young in educating our youth that it's okay to shoot does and let the bucks walk on that particular weekend. And the more you can do, I think the better off we will be. And you're right, it is a cultural change, and Michigan does a great job at shooting bucks, but a crappy job at shooting does.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
I could add just one clarification, Chair Kildee, just to point out the difference between the sort of non-administrative changes that Chad presented. The order, as it's stated right now, would be to return the antlered opportunities for the Liberty and Independence hunt. So if you were to vote on the order as it currently is written, those antlered opportunities would be restored. The antlerless opportunities with archery equipment in the Upper Peninsula is currently not in the order, it's in the memo. So again, if you just approve the order as is written, it would be status quo for that topic. So in order to make that change, if you wanted to entertain the change of antlerless opportunities with archery equipment, an amendment would have to be asked for and added into it and certainly voted on. So I wanted to pull out those two distinctions because of how the order is written and how the memo is constructed, that there are two different things, and I wanted to make sure that there's clarity there as things are going to be deliberated on over the next month.
Mr. Chair, I would like to entertain the motion for when we make the decisions on deer regulations to include antlerless during archery season in the UP.
Very well. Anything further?
Well, I think at this time it'd probably be a good idea. I would like to also work with staff, particularly Brooke, on language that would open up the entire state of Michigan for antler point restrictions, and I can get into detail as to how I would like that broken down.
Thank you. Further comments, discussion?
That was the end of the director's report.
All right. Thank you, Director Vaughn. Next on the agenda is notation that there is a legislative report that has been included in the commissioner packets and is linked online in the agenda for the reference. Any questions on that? If not, we're at the point in the meeting where we will break for lunch. Are we doing the full 45 minutes? We will break for 45 minutes, starting now. We are in recess.
Now